Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Boaz Cotterill had been running the US 95 corridor between Reno and Las Vegas for the better part of 11 years. And in all that time, he'd learned to read the desert the way some men read the stock market or a woman's face. The Nevada stretch wasn't like other highways. It didn't forgive mistakes, didn't offer second chances, and it sure as hell didn't care if you were having a bad night. The desert had its own rules, and if you didn't respect them, you paid. Sometimes with your rig, sometimes with more. It was late October when this particular run started. The kind of autumn night where the temperature dropped fast once the sun disappeared behind the Toyabe Range. Boaz had left Reno just after 7 p.m. with a full load of industrial equipment destined for a mining operation outside Tonopah. 43,000 pounds of generators, drill components, and hydraulic parts, all strapped down tight and logged proper in his electronic system. The load wasn't special, wasn't dangerous, wasn't anything he hadn't hauled 100 times before. Just another night's work, another paycheck, another stretch of empty highway that most people only saw from 30,000 feet, if they saw it at all. The rig was a 2015 Freightliner Cascadia, white cab with enough miles on it to show character, but not enough to make him nervous. Boaz kept it clean, kept it maintained, kept it running like the professional operation it was supposed to be. The engine hummed steady as he climbed out of the Reno Valley, headlights cutting through the gathering darkness as civilization thinned and finally disappeared altogether. By the time he hit the long stretch south of Fernley, it was just him, the road, and the vast emptiness that made Nevada what it was. He'd fueled up at the last major truck stop before the lonely part began, topped off his DEF fluid, grabbed 2 thermoses of coffee and a sandwich he knew he probably wouldn't eat. The kid at the counter had been new, fumbling with the register, apologizing for the delay. Boaz had just smiled and told him to take his time. No rush. Never any rush on this route. The desert would still be there when he arrived, patient as stone, waiting like it had waited for 10,000 years. The CB radio muttered occasionally with distant traffic, other drivers calling out Smokies or asking about road conditions further south. Boaz kept the volume low, just background noise to break up the monotony. His phone sat in the cradle on the dash, service dropping to nothing as he pushed deeper into the empty country between nowhere and nothing. That was normal, expected. You learned to live without connectivity out here. Learned to trust your own judgment and your own eyes because there wasn't anyone else to call if things went sideways. Around mile marker 87, just past the turnoff for some abandoned mining camp whose name he'd never bothered to learn, Boaz noticed his fuel gauge sitting lower than it should. Not critical, not even worrying yet, but enough to make him frown and do the math in his head. He'd filled the tanks completely back in Fernley, should have had enough to make Tonopah with a comfortable margin. But the needle was reading lower than his mental calculations suggested it should. He tapped the gauge with one knuckle, old habit, as if that would somehow make the numbers change. They didn't. He ran through the possibilities. Leak in the tank, maybe, though he'd have smelled diesel if it was bad. Faulty gauge reading, possible but unlikely since he'd had the truck serviced 3 weeks ago. Or just the desert playing tricks with his head, making him second-guess numbers he knew were right. He decided to keep an eye on it, recalculate at the next mile marker, and if things didn't add up, he'd make a call about where to stop. The last thing he wanted was to run dry on this stretch. There were places to be stranded, and then there were places where being stranded meant real problems. The highway rolled on, 2 lanes of asphalt cutting through country that looked the same in every direction. Sage and scrub, distant mountains like torn paper against the darkening sky. No lights anywhere except his own. The moon hadn't risen yet, wouldn't for another 2 hours. And the darkness out here was the kind that city people never experienced. Complete. Total. The kind that made you understand why ancient humans feared the night, why they huddled around fires and told stories to keep the shadows at bay. Boaz had made this run in every season, every condition, every time of day and night. He'd seen dust storms that turned noon into midnight, seen snow close the road in January, seen heat mirages in July that looked like lakes stretching to the horizon. He'd seen a meteor shower so bright it lit up the whole desert like daylight, seen lightning storms that never made a sound, just flickered and flashed in clouds 50 miles away. The desert showed you things, taught you things, reminded you how small you were in the grand scheme. But he'd never seen what he saw at mile marker 92. At first it registered as just shapes in the road ahead, dark forms that his headlights hadn't quite resolved yet. Boaz eased off the throttle slightly, letting the rig slow as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The shapes took form as he closed the distance. A vehicle, he realized, sitting sideways across both lanes. Not pulled over, not parked on the shoulder, but positioned deliberately to block the entire width of the highway. Behind it, visible in the spill of his lights, stood a figure waving both arms in a crossing pattern. The universal signal for stop, for emergency, for help needed right now. Boaz felt his gut tighten. Something about the scene didn't sit right, though he couldn't immediately articulate what. The vehicle was a dark SUV, maybe black or dark blue, hard to tell in the insufficient light. No flashers, no emergency triangles, no flares. Just the vehicle and the person, and as he got closer, he could see it was a man, average build, wearing what looked like a reflective vest. The kind highway workers wore, the kind that was supposed to signal authority and safety. Every instinct Boaz had developed over 11 years of long-haul trucking started screaming. This wasn't right. The position of the vehicle was too precise, too deliberate. A real breakdown would be on the shoulder. Hazards flashing, driver standing well back from traffic. This looked staged. This looked like someone wanted him to stop, wanted him committed to a full break before he could reconsider. He was still 100 yards out when he made his decision. His hand moved to the CB mic, keying it without taking his eyes off the road ahead. Any commercial traffic on US 95 southbound near mile 92. This is a North Star rig approaching a vehicle blocking both lanes, driver flagging stop. Can anyone confirm or advise? Static answered him. The channel was dead quiet, which meant he was alone out here, which meant whatever happened next was on him and nobody else. The flagging man was now clearly visible, and Boaz could see his face, or at least the general features. 30s maybe, clean-shaven, expression neutral. Not panicked, not distressed, just waiting. That was what clinched it for Boaz. A person with a real emergency shows emotion, fear, relief, desperation, something. This man looked like he was clocking in for a shift. Boaz made his choice. He kept his speed steady, didn't brake, didn't slow beyond what he'd already done. His right hand moved to the air horn lanyard above his head, and he gave it one long, aggressive blast. The sound shattered the desert silence, echoing off distant hills, announcing his presence and his intention. He wasn't stopping. The flagging man's expression changed then, surprise flickering across his features before hardening into something else. Something that confirmed every alarm bell in Boaz's head. The SUV was still blocking both lanes, but there was maybe 18 inches of shoulder on the right side, maybe 2 feet on the left. The right shoulder dropped off into soft sand and scrub, no good for a loaded rig. The left shoulder was bordered by a low berm and then open desert. Risky, but possible. Boaz made a split-second calculation based on years of knowing exactly how wide his truck was, exactly how much clearance he had, exactly what his margins were. He swung left, committing to the pass. The man was running now, moving toward the SUV, shouting something Boaz couldn't hear over the engine and the horn blast he'd just laid down. The left side of Boaz's truck cleared the SUV's rear bumper with maybe 6 inches to spare, close enough that he felt the trailer sway slightly as it passed. Then he was through, accelerating hard, watching the mirror as the scene fell away behind him. The man was standing in the middle of the road now, just a silhouette in Boaz's taillights, and the SUV wasn't moving, wasn't pursuing, just sitting there, and that was somehow worse than if they'd given chase. Boaz's heart was hammering against his ribs, adrenaline making his hands shake slightly on the wheel. He forced himself to breathe steady, forced himself to think clearly. He grabbed his phone, knowing it was useless but checking anyway. No service. Of course no service. He was still 30 miles from Tonopah, 30 miles from anything resembling civilization or help. He kept his speed up, pushing 5 miles over what the rig liked on this stretch, watching the mirrors constantly for headlights following, for pursuit, for whatever came next. Nothing came. The road behind him stayed dark. Mile marker 93 passed, then 94, then 95. The desert swallowed the incident like it had never happened, like the road behind him had simply ceased to exist. But Boaz couldn't shake the image of that man's face, the way his expression had changed when he realized Boaz wasn't stopping. Not anger, not frustration, recognition. Like he'd seen this play out before, like he knew exactly what would happen next, in whatever script they'd been running. By mile marker 98, Boaz's breathing had steadied, but his mind was racing through implications. That wasn't a breakdown. That was a setup. The question was, setup for what? Robbery made sense, maybe, though what they'd expect to get from a commercial rig wasn't clear. Most truckers didn't carry cash, didn't carry valuables, just hauled loads from point A to point B, unless they knew something about his load specifically, unless someone had tipped them about what he was carrying. But his manifest was just industrial equipment, nothing valuable enough to justify this kind of operation. The other possibility, the one he didn't want to think about but couldn't avoid, was that the load itself wasn't the target. That they wanted the truck, wanted the trailer, wanted the vehicle for some other purpose, hauling their own cargo maybe, using a legitimate commercial truck with legitimate plates and paperwork to move something that didn't want to be seen. That thought made his stomach turn, made him check his load locks and door seals in the mirror even though he couldn't see them in the dark. Mile marker 102 brought the first scattered lights of Tonopah's outer reaches, and Boaz felt some of the tension leak out of his shoulders. He wasn't safe yet, not really, but he was close enough to civilization that whatever had been planned back at mile 92 couldn't happen here. Too many potential witnesses, too much light, too much risk. He pulled into the first well-lit truck stop he found, a 24-hour operation with a dozen other rigs already parked and a bright fluorescent glow that felt like sanctuary. He set the brakes and killed the engine, then just sat there for a moment, hands still on the wheel, processing what had just happened. Through the windshield, he could see other drivers moving around, normal night shift trucking operations, everything ordinary and mundane and safe, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just avoided something, that the wrong choice back at mile 92 would have led somewhere he didn't want to imagine. His phone picked up service as the network towers came into range, and the device immediately buzzed with 3 missed call notifications and 2 voicemails. Boaz stared at the screen, frowning. Nobody called him on runs unless it was important, unless something was wrong. The first number he didn't recognize. The second was his dispatcher's mobile, the emergency line, not the office. The third was the same unknown number from the first call. He played the first voicemail, and his dispatcher's voice filled the cab, tight with controlled urgency. "Boaz, it's Marty. Need you to call me back immediately. Doesn't matter what time. It's about your load. Don't, and I repeat, don't make any unexpected stops between Fernley and Tonopah. Something's come up, and we need to talk before you unload. Call me the second you get service." The voicemail had been left 45 minutes ago, right around the time Boaz had been passing mile marker 87, right before he'd encountered the staged roadblock. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Boaz felt the adrenaline spike again, felt his mouth go dry as implications clicked into place like tumblers in a lock. He played the second voicemail from the unknown number, and a man's voice came through, professional, but carrying an edge that made Boaz sit up straighter. "Mr. Cotterill, this is Trooper Creed Ellison with Nevada Highway Patrol. We've received information regarding your southbound route on US 95 tonight, and I need to speak with you urgently. Do not stop your vehicle until you reach Tonopah city limits. If you encounter any obstacles or flagged stops before then, do not engage. Proceed with caution and contact us immediately. My callback number is—" Boaz saved the number and immediately dialed it, his finger shaking slightly as he pressed the screen. The phone rang twice before connecting. "Trooper Ellison." The voice was the same from the voicemail, flat professional with an undertone of alert readiness. "This is Boaz Cotterill. You left me a voicemail about my route tonight." Boaz kept his voice steady, though his pulse was hammering in his ears. "I just pulled into Tonopah. I need to tell you what happened at mile 92. There was a brief pause, and Boaz heard papers rustling in the background. "Mile 92. What exactly did you encounter, Mr. Cotterill?" Boaz walked him through it. The SUV blocking both lanes, the man in the reflective vest, the decision to pass on the shoulder, the lack of pursuit afterward. He kept it factual, kept it precise, left out his emotional reactions, and stuck to what he'd seen. When he finished, the silence on the other end stretched long enough that Boaz thought the call had dropped. Finally, Trooper Ellison spoke again, and his voice had shifted, become harder. "You did the right thing not stopping. We've had reports of similar setups on that stretch over the past 3 weeks. This is the first time we've had a driver actually encounter one and call it in immediately. I need you to stay exactly where you are. Don't unload, don't let anyone approach your trailer, don't open the doors for any reason. I'm 20 minutes out, and I'm bringing backup. Can you do that for me, Mr. Cotterill?" "I can do that." Boaz's voice came out rougher than he intended. "What's going on? What's in my trailer that's worth all this? According to your manifest, you're hauling industrial equipment for a mining operation. Is that correct?" The trooper's tone suggested he already knew the answer, was asking for confirmation rather than information. "That's what my paperwork says. Generators, drill parts, hydraulic equipment. Nothing special, nothing I haven't hauled before." "Mr. Cotterill, when's the last time you physically verified your load? Actually opened the trailer and looked inside?" The question hit Boaz like cold water. "At the depot in Reno, when I loaded. That was 6 hours ago. It's been sealed since then. Hasn't been opened. Hasn't been touched. Why?" "Because we have reason to believe someone may have compromised your load before you left Reno. We think what's on your manifest isn't what's actually in your trailer. And we think the people who put it there wanted to make sure you didn't make it to Tonopah with a legitimate delivery. They wanted to intercept you somewhere isolated, somewhere they could swap loads or disappear your rig entirely. The roadblock at mile 92 wasn't random, Mr. Cotterill. It was specifically set up for you." Boaz felt his breath catch. He turned in his seat to stare at the trailer behind him, innocent-looking white rectangle sitting exactly where it should be, doors sealed with the same plastic tag he'd verified before leaving Reno. Except now, the trooper was telling him that seal didn't mean what he thought it meant, that his load wasn't what he thought it was, that he'd been hauling something unknown across Nevada all night without realizing it. "What do you think is in there?" Boaz's voice came out quieter than he intended. "I'm not going to speculate over the phone, but I need you to understand something. The people who tried to stop you tonight, they're not going to just give up because you made it past one roadblock. If they know you're in Tonopah, if they know you called us, they're going to escalate. They're going to try something else, which is why I need you to stay visible, stay in public, and don't let that trailer out of your sight until we arrive. Can you promise me that?" "I can promise that." Boaz scanned the truck stop parking lot, counting vehicles, counting people, looking for anything that didn't fit. Everything looked normal. Everything looked safe. But so had the highway right up until it wasn't. "Good. I'm 15 minutes out now. Keep this line open if you can, and if anything changes, anything at all, you tell me immediately." Boaz agreed and settled in to wait, phone pressed to his ear, eyes on the mirrors, watching the desert darkness beyond the truck stop's bright lights. Somewhere out there, on an empty stretch of highway he'd driven 100 times before, people were waiting. People who wanted what was in his trailer badly enough to stage an ambush. People who had compromised his load before he'd even left Reno. People who now knew he'd made it through their trap and called the authorities. He checked the side mirror and froze. A dark SUV had just pulled into the truck stop entrance, moving slowly past the diesel pumps, headlights off. It looked like the same make and model from mile 92, though he couldn't be certain. The vehicle circled once, slowly, like a shark testing the perimeter, then pulled into a parking spot 3 rows behind Boaz's trailer. The lights killed completely. Nobody got out. "Trooper," Boaz said quietly into the phone, "I think they just followed me here." "Stay in the cab." Trooper Ellison's voice came through the phone, sharp and controlled. "Lock your doors. Keep the engine running if you need to, but do not step out of that truck. I'm 12 minutes away now, and I've got 2 more units converging from different directions. Just keep eyes on that SUV and tell me if anything changes." Boaz's hand had already moved to the door lock, clicking it down with a solid thunk that somehow didn't make him feel any safer. The dark SUV sat 3 rows back, positioned at an angle where the driver would have a clear view of Boaz's trailer doors. No movement inside that he could see, no interior lights, no signs of life. Just a dark shape in a parking lot full of dark shapes, except this one had followed him off the highway, had tracked him here, had parked with deliberate intent. He checked his other mirrors, scanning the entire lot systematically. 2 other trucks were running their engines, refrigerated units humming in the night. A family in a minivan was fueling up at the diesel pumps, kids visible through the windows, completely oblivious to the tension playing out 30 yards away. The truck stop itself was bright and busy, the kind of anonymous roadside operation that saw hundreds of travelers every night and remembered none of them. Safety in numbers, Boaz thought, except numbers didn't mean much when the threat was sitting right there, waiting, watching. "They're not moving," Boaz reported quietly, as if the people in the SUV might somehow hear him through the sealed cab. "No one's gotten out. It's just sitting there." "That's what they do," Ellison replied, and Boaz could hear the trooper's vehicle accelerating in the background, engine noise rising. "They're assessing, trying to figure out if you've made us, if you've called anyone, what your next move is. They're not going to do anything aggressive in a public place unless they're desperate. And right now they're probably still thinking they can salvage this. Just stay put and stay alert." Boaz kept his eyes locked on the SUV, but his mind was churning through the implications of everything that had happened. Someone had compromised his load back in Reno before he'd even left the depot. That meant inside access. Someone with credentials. Someone who knew shipping schedules and routes and security procedures. The roadblock at mile 92 had been positioned perfectly, timed perfectly, which meant they'd been tracking him somehow, knew exactly where he'd be and when. And now they were here, in Tonopah, still pursuing whatever objective they'd started with. The question that kept circling in his head was simple and terrifying. What was in his trailer that was worth all this? Industrial equipment didn't warrant this kind of operation. Nobody staged highway ambushes over generators and drill parts, which meant the trooper was right. His manifest was a lie, and he'd been hauling something else entirely across Nevada without knowing it. Something valuable enough, illegal enough, dangerous enough to justify the resources being thrown at recovering it. A pair of headlights swept into the parking lot, and Boaz tensed. But it was just another commercial truck, a long hauler with California plates looking for a parking spot. The driver found one on the opposite side of the lot, well away from the drama Boaz was locked into. Normal trucking operations continuing around him like nothing was wrong, because to everyone else, nothing was. Just another night, just another stop, just another driver catching a break before the next leg. "Second unit is 4 minutes out," Ellison said, his voice cutting through Boaz's thoughts. "I'm about 8 minutes now. Has anyone approached your truck? Anyone walking through the lot? Anyone near your trailer?" Boaz scanned again, systematic and thorough. "Negative. A few people moving between the store and their vehicles, but nobody's come close to my rig. The SUV is still stationary." "Good. That's good. They're waiting for something, probably waiting to see if we show up, if this is a law enforcement situation or just a nervous driver. The longer we can keep them guessing, the better." A thought struck Boaz, cold and unwelcome. "Trooper, they had to know I'd call you. They had to know that once I got past the roadblock, first thing I'd do is contact authorities. So why follow me here? Why not just cut their losses and run?" The silence on the other end lasted just a fraction too long, and when Ellison spoke again, his voice had taken on a harder edge. "Because whatever's in that trailer is worth the risk, or because they think they can still recover the situation. Could be they have a backup plan. Could be they're improvising. Could be they're just committed enough to see this through regardless of the complications. I've seen operations like this before, Mr. Cotterell. The people running them, they don't think like normal criminals. They think in terms of investment and return, risk and reward. And they calculate differently than you or I would." Boaz thought about the man in the reflective vest, standing in the middle of US 95 at mile 92, flagging him down with professional precision. Not panicked, not desperate, just working. Doing a job. That was what had struck him as wrong even before he'd understood why. The man had the demeanor of someone clocking in for a shift, following a procedure, executing a plan. This wasn't street-level crime, wasn't opportunistic theft. This was organized, funded, planned. Movement caught his eye. The SUV's driver door had cracked open, just barely. Interior light deliberately disabled so no glow spilled out. A figure emerged, and even in the inadequate parking lot lighting, Boaz could make out general details. Male, average height, wearing dark clothing that could have been anything from casual wear to tactical gear. The man didn't look toward Boaz's truck, didn't acknowledge it at all. He just started walking casually toward the truck stop entrance, hands in pockets, posture relaxed. To anyone else, he'd look like just another traveler stretching his legs, heading inside for coffee or a restroom break. "Someone just got out of the SUV," Boaz reported, keeping his voice low and steady. "Male, dark clothes, walking toward the main building. He's not looking at my truck, acting casual. Can you see if anyone else is still in the vehicle? Ellison asked immediately. Boaz adjusted his angle, trying to peer through the SUV's tinted windows without making it obvious he was watching. The interior was too dark, the angle too poor. Can't tell. Windows are tinted, no interior lights. Could be empty, could have someone else in there. Assume it's occupied until proven otherwise. The person who got out, they're either going inside for reconnaissance, checking to see if you've contacted anyone, or they're creating a distraction. Standard two-man operation. One draws attention, one makes the move. Keep watching that trailer, and if anyone approaches it, you lay on that air horn and don't stop until they're gone, or we arrive. The man had reached the truck stop entrance and disappeared inside, and now Boaz was locked in the uncomfortable position of watching two places at once: the SUV that might or might not have another occupant, and his trailer that might or might not be about to get compromised. His right hand rested on the air horn lanyard, ready to yank it at the first sign of movement near his rig. His left hand kept the phone pressed to his ear, maintaining that thin lifeline to help that was still minutes away. Time crawled. Seconds felt like minutes. Minutes felt like hours. Boaz's eyes flicked between mirrors, between the SUV and the trailer and the truck stop entrance, maintaining a constant rotation that left him feeling dizzy and hyper-alert at the same time. Other trucks continued their normal operations around him, drivers moving through their routines, oblivious to the silent standoff playing out in their midst. He envied them that ignorance, envied the simplicity of a normal night, where the biggest concern was making your delivery window and finding decent coffee. The truck stop door opened, and the man from the SUV reappeared, holding a large coffee cup and what looked like a sandwich wrapped in plastic. He walked with the same casual gait, same relaxed posture, took a sip from his coffee as he made his way back across the parking lot. He didn't look at Boaz's truck, didn't glance in that direction even once, but Boaz had been driving long enough to recognize a performance when he saw one. The man was aware of every sightline, every angle, every potential observer. He was just skilled enough to make it look natural. He's coming back, Boaz murmured, carrying food and coffee, playing the role. But he knows I'm watching. They always know, Ellison replied. The question is whether they care. Professional operators, they'll maintain the cover regardless, keep up the appearance of normalcy even when they know the game is over. Amateurs get nervous, start making mistakes. This crew doesn't sound like amateurs. The man reached the SUV, got in, door closing, with a soft click that Boaz couldn't hear but could imagine. The vehicle's brake lights flared once, a brief red glow, then killed. Still no headlights, still no movement toward the exit. They were settling in, Boaz realized, planning to wait. The question was, waiting for what? For the parking lot to empty? For Boaz to make a mistake? For an opportunity that might not come? Red and blue lights suddenly strobed across the parking lot entrance, and Boaz felt a wave of relief so intense it nearly made him dizzy. A highway patrol cruiser rolled in fast, followed immediately by a second one from the opposite direction, and both vehicles positioned themselves with tactical precision. One blocked the parking lot exit. The other took a position with clear sight lines to both Boaz's truck and the dark SUV. Doors opened and officers emerged, hands resting near their service weapons, movements controlled and professional. "We're here," Ellison's voice confirmed unnecessarily. "That's me in the lead vehicle. Second unit is Trooper McCready. Stay in your cab until I give you the all clear. We're going to handle this carefully and by the book." Boaz watched through his mirrors as the troopers approached the SUV with deliberate caution, one on each side, maintaining angles and distance. The SUV's driver door opened slowly, hands visible first, Then the man Boaz had seen earlier emerged with the careful movements of someone who understood exactly how this scenario played out. The second trooper circled to the passenger side, flashlight cutting through the tinted windows, confirming what Boaz had suspected. The SUV had a second occupant. The detention was textbook. Both occupants were removed from the vehicle, positioned in clear sight, hands visible at all times. No aggression, no resistance, just cold professional compliance from people who knew the drill. That bothered Boaz more than if they'd tried to run or fight. These weren't desperate criminals caught in the act. These were operators who'd been caught this time, but would be back in operation soon enough, with better planning, better intelligence, better execution. Trooper Ellison broke away from the scene and approached Boaz's truck, knocking on the driver's window with professional courtesy. Boaz cracked the door open, still not quite ready to fully exit the sanctuary of his cab. "Mr. Cotterill, I'm Trooper Creed Ellison. You can step down now, sir. The immediate threat is contained." Ellison was mid-40s, weathered face that had seen too much Nevada sun, eyes that assessed everything with the automatic threat evaluation of someone who'd spent decades in law enforcement. He didn't offer a handshake, kept his hands free, and his posture balanced, professional to the core. Boaz climbed down, legs slightly unsteady after the adrenaline crash, and followed Ellison toward the rear of his trailer. 2 more official vehicles had arrived while he was watching the SUV detention, and now the truck stop parking lot looked like a crime scene, which in fairness, it probably was. "We need to inspect your load," Ellison said, producing a bolt cutter from his patrol vehicle. "I know your manifest says industrial equipment, and I know your seals were intact when you left Reno, but we've received intelligence that suggests someone compromised your load before those seals were applied. With your permission, we're going to open this trailer and verify exactly what you've been hauling." Boaz nodded, mouth too dry to speak properly. He produced his paperwork from the cab, showed Ellison the loading documentation, the seal numbers, the manifest that listed generators and drill components and hydraulic parts. All of it looked legitimate. All of it backed by proper chain of custody documentation. All of it potentially meaningless if someone had gotten to his load before the official loading process had even started. The bolt cutter made short work of the seal, plastic tag dropping away with a snap that felt far too final. Ellison's hand moved to his service weapon, not drawing it but resting there, ready. Another trooper positioned himself at an angle with clear sightlines. They were treating this like a potential threat, Boaz realized. They weren't sure what was in there either, weren't taking chances. The trailer doors swung open with the familiar groan of hinges and seals breaking, and Boaz's breath caught as the interior was revealed in the harsh glare of tactical flashlights. For a long moment, nobody moved, nobody spoke. They just stared at what the lights revealed. The front third of the trailer contained exactly what the manifest specified. Industrial generators, still strapped in place, documentation labels visible. Normal, legitimate cargo that matched every piece of paperwork Boaz carried. But behind that legitimate cargo, separated by a false wall that had been professionally constructed to look like the trailer's actual front panel, was the rest of the space. And that space wasn't empty. Wooden crates, dozens of them, unmarked except for strings of numbers that meant nothing to Boaz. They were packed tight, secured with cargo straps, stacked with the kind of precision that spoke to professional loading operations. Between the crates, Boaz could see shapes wrapped in thick plastic, bundles that could have been anything but probably weren't anything good. "Jesus Christ," one of the younger troopers muttered, and Ellison shot him a look that killed any further commentary. Ellison pulled out his phone, took several photographs, then made a call that lasted less than 30 seconds. When he hung up, his expression had shifted into something harder, more official. "Mr. Cotterill, I need you to understand something. What you're looking at isn't your load. You were never supposed to see this. The people who set up the roadblock at mile 92, they were planning to intercept you before you reached Tonopah, swap out the real cargo for something that matched your manifest, and send you on your way with a cover story about mechanical problems or a temporary detour. You'd deliver the generators, sign off on the paperwork, and never know you'd been part of a smuggling operation. Boaz stared at the crates, at the wrapped bundles, at the evidence of an operation that had turned him into an unwitting criminal without his knowledge or consent. "What is it?" His voice came out hoarse. "What am I hauling?" "We won't know for certain until we get federal agents out here to properly inventory and test everything, but based on similar operations we've interdicted in the past?" Ellison's eyes met his, and there was something like sympathy there, mixed with the professional distance. Could be weapons, could be drugs, could be stolen electronics or pharmaceuticals, could be all of the above. What matters right now is that you didn't know. You called us the moment something felt wrong and you followed procedure. That goes a long way in terms of establishing your lack of involvement. The relief Boaz felt at those words was immediately overwhelmed by a creeping sense of violation. His truck, his trailer, his cargo manifest, his professional reputation, all of it had been compromised and weaponized by people he'd never met for purposes he couldn't fathom. He'd been driving across Nevada all night hauling contraband, completely unaware, completely innocent, and completely vulnerable to whatever consequences would have followed if he'd been caught. "The people in the SUV," Boaz said, forcing himself to focus on immediate problems rather than the larger implications. "Are they talking?" Ellison's expression suggested the answer before he spoke. "They've lawyered up already. Not a word, not a syllable. They know the drill, know what they can and can't be charged with based on what we witnessed tonight. Following a truck isn't a crime. Parking in a public lot isn't a crime. We might get them on the roadblock if we can place them at mile 92, but without physical evidence or witnesses, that's going to be difficult. They're professionals, Mr. Cotterill. This isn't their first operation, and it won't be their last." More vehicles were arriving now, unmarked sedans that screamed federal presence. Men and women in suits emerged, IDs displayed, taking command of the scene with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this before. DEA, Boaz guessed, or maybe FBI, possibly both. The truck stop's manager had come out to see what the commotion was about, standing at a careful distance, phone in hand, probably already calling corporate to report that his parking lot had become a federal crime scene. An agent approached, a woman in her 40s with short gray hair, and eyes that cataloged everything without seeming to. "Mr. Cotterill, I'm Special Agent Verdon with the DEA. I need to ask you some questions about your route tonight, your loading procedures in Reno, and anything unusual you might have observed before you left. This is going to take a while, and I apologize for the inconvenience, but your cooperation is critical to understanding how this operation was structured." Boaz nodded, suddenly exhausted, adrenaline finally giving way to a bone-deep fatigue that made standing upright feel like a monumental effort. He followed Agent Verdon to one of the unmarked vehicles, climbed into the back seat, and began the process of recounting every detail of his night. The loading depot in Reno, the routine he'd followed, the people he'd interacted with, the moment he'd noticed his fuel gauge reading lower than expected, the roadblock at mile 92, the decision to bypass it, the SUV following him to Tonopah. All of it documented, recorded, analyzed for clues about how the operation had been structured and who might be involved. Hours blurred together. Coffee appeared at some point. Truck stop coffee in a paper cup that tasted like cardboard but provided caffeine. Other truckers had been moved to different sections of the parking lot, their routes disrupted, but their cooperation necessary for securing the scene. Boaz caught glimpses through the sedan's windows of his trailer being systematically emptied, each crate documented and photographed and loaded into federal vehicles for transport to whatever facility handled evidence in operations like this. Dawn was breaking over the Nevada desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed impossibly beautiful given the circumstances, when Agent Verdon finally closed her notebook and offered something that might have been a smile. "You're free to go, Mr. Cotterell. We'll need your truck and trailer for a few more days while we process everything, but we've arranged for a rental vehicle to take you back to Reno. Your company's been notified, and they understand this situation was beyond your control. You'll need to make yourself available for follow-up interviews, possibly testimony if this goes to trial, but for now, you're done." Boaz stepped out of the sedan into morning air that felt crisp and clean and normal, like the desert was pretending nothing had happened, like the night had been just another night. His truck sat empty now, trailer doors hanging open, interior stripped and sterile under the forensic team's attention. They'd taken everything, cataloged everything, left nothing but the shell of a commercial vehicle that suddenly felt like a stranger. Trooper Ellison appeared beside him, holding a business card. "You did good tonight, Mr. Cotterell. A lot of drivers would have stopped at that roadblock, would have trusted the situation, would have gotten into serious trouble. Your instincts saved you from becoming a victim or an accomplice. That matters." Boaz took the card, studied it without really reading it. "What happens now? To the people you arrested, to the operation, to my reputation? The people we detained tonight will probably make bail and disappear. That's the reality of how these things work. The operation will adapt, find new routes, new drivers, new methods. And your reputation?" Ellison's expression softened slightly. "You're the victim here. You did everything right, called authorities immediately, cooperated fully. That's documented, that's official, that's what matters. Any trucking company worth working for will understand that." The rental car arrived, a generic sedan with California plates and that new car smell that seemed absurd given the circumstances. The driver handed Boaz the keys, pointed out the basic controls, wished him a safe trip with the casual tone of someone who had no idea what kind of night he'd just survived. Boaz climbed in, adjusted the seat and mirrors with automatic precision, and started the engine. As he pulled out of the truck stop parking lot, he looked in the rearview mirror one last time. His truck stood alone in the morning light, surrounded by federal vehicles and personnel, stripped of its cargo and its innocence. He'd driven that rig for 3 years, hauled thousands of loads, covered hundreds of thousands of miles, and in one night, everything he thought he knew about the job, about the routes, about the security of commercial shipping operations, had been fundamentally compromised. The drive back to Reno should have taken 4 hours. Boaz made it in 5, stopping twice just to sit in parking lots and process what had happened, to let his hands stop shaking, to convince himself that it was really over. By the time he reached the city limits, his phone had accumulated 17 voicemails and 32 texts. Everyone from his dispatcher to his insurance company to other drivers he'd worked with over the years, all wanting to know if he was okay, if the rumors were true, if it was really as bad as the news was reporting. He ignored them all and drove straight to his apartment, a modest 1-bedroom in a complex that housed mostly service industry workers and retirees. He parked the rental car, climbed the stairs to his unit, unlocked the door, and stood in his own living room feeling like a stranger in his own life. Everything looked the same. Everything was different. His phone rang. Dispatcher. He answered it out of professional habit more than any desire to talk. "Boaz, thank God. Are you okay? We heard what happened. The feds came by the depot. They're interviewing everyone who had access to your load. This is insane, man. This is absolutely insane." "I'm okay," Boaz heard himself say, though he wasn't sure if it was true. I'm home. I'm safe. I'm just processing. Take whatever time you need. We've got your routes covered. We've got insurance handling everything. You just focus on yourself right now. And Boaz, you did the right thing out there. You trusted your instincts, and you're alive because of it. Remember that. Boaz hung up and sat on his couch, staring at nothing, thinking about a man in a reflective vest standing on US 95 at mile 92, flagging down trucks with professional precision. Thinking about a dark SUV parked in a truck stop lot, occupants who'd lawyered up immediately and would probably never face real consequences for what they'd tried to do. Thinking about wooden crates and wrapped bundles that had been hidden behind a false wall in his trailer, cargo he'd been hauling without knowledge or consent across a desert that suddenly felt a lot less empty than it used to. His phone buzzed, a text from a number he didn't recognize. Just 4 words that made his blood run cold. Should have stopped, Boaz. He stared at the message for a long moment, then forwarded it to Trooper Ellison's number without responding. The reply came back within 2 minutes. Screenshot that, don't respond, we're tracing it now. Change your number if you need to. This isn't over, but we're on it. Boaz set the phone down and looked at his hands. They were shaking again, fine tremors he couldn't control. He'd thought reaching Tonopah meant safety, thought cooperating with authorities meant the end of his involvement. But that text message said otherwise. Someone knew his name, knew his number, knew he'd reported everything. And they wanted him to know they knew. The desert stretched out there beyond his windows, vast and empty, and full of secrets. Somewhere in that emptiness, people were regrouping, planning, adapting. And Boaz Cotterill, professional trucker, who just wanted to make a delivery and earn his paycheck, was now part of their calculations, a variable they needed to account for, a problem they might need to solve. He thought about the roadblock at mile 92, about what would have happened if he'd stopped. Would they have killed him? Threatened him? Forced him to drive somewhere else, somewhere remote, somewhere no one would find him? Or would they have simply taken his truck, swapped the cargo, sent him on his way with a story he'd never question? He'd never know now, and that uncertainty was its own kind of horror. Sleep was impossible. Boaz made coffee, sat at his kitchen table, and started writing down everything he could remember. Times, locations, descriptions, details. The agent had recorded his statement, but this was for him, a record of his own memory before time and trauma distorted it. He wrote until his hand cramped, until the morning became afternoon, until his phone started ringing again with numbers he didn't recognize and didn't answer. By evening, he'd made a decision. He called his dispatcher back. I need a new route, he said. Different corridor, different cargo, different everything. Can you make that happen? The pause on the other end suggested the answer before it came. Boaz, you need time off. You need to process this, talk to someone, take care of yourself. You can't just jump back behind the wheel and pretend nothing happened. I know what happened, Boaz said, voice harder than he intended. I know exactly what happened, and sitting in my apartment thinking about it isn't going to help. I need to drive. I need normal routes, normal cargo, normal nights. Can you make that happen or not? Another pause, then a sigh. Let me see what I can do. Give me a couple days to sort things out with insurance and legal. But Boaz, when you're ready to talk to someone, really talk, there are resources, counseling, peer support, all of it confidential. Think about it, okay? Boaz agreed and hung up, though he had no intention of talking to counselors or support groups. What would he say? That he'd gotten lucky, trusted his instincts, done everything right, and still ended up with death threats texted to his personal number. That the desert he'd driven for 11 years now felt full of invisible threats, every shadow potentially hiding someone who wanted him silenced. That he couldn't tell the difference anymore between paranoia and legitimate caution. His phone buzzed again. Another text from the same unknown number. "We know where you live." This time, Boaz didn't forward it to Ellison. He grabbed his keys, grabbed the go bag he kept packed for emergencies, and walked out of his apartment without looking back. The rental car started on the first try, and he drove without destination, just distance, putting miles between himself and whatever was coming, because something was coming. That much was clear. The people behind the operation at mile 92 weren't going to just let him walk away. They'd invested too much, risked too much, lost too much when he'd called authorities. He was a loose end now, and loose ends got tied off. As Boaz merged onto I-80 heading east, away from Reno, away from his apartment, away from everything familiar, he finally understood what the trooper had meant when he said this wasn't over. It wasn't about cargo or arrests or federal investigations. It was about him, about what he knew, about what he could testify to if this ever went to trial. He was evidence now, evidence that could walk and talk and potentially destroy someone's very profitable operation. The desert stretched out ahead of him, dark and vast and indifferent. Somewhere in that darkness, people were making decisions about Boaz Cotterell. Whether he was worth the risk of eliminating, whether they could scare him into silence, whether he was smart enough to disappear on his own, or stupid enough to think law enforcement could really protect him. Boaz didn't have answers to any of those questions. All he had was a rental car, a go bag, and the certainty that US 95 at mile 92 had changed his life permanently. He'd done everything right that night, made all the correct choices, followed every procedure, and somehow that had made everything worse. The road unwound ahead of him, white lines flickering in his headlights, and Boaz Cotterell drove into a darkness that felt a lot less empty than it used to. Boaz drove through the night without real destination, just motion, just distance between himself and Reno. The I-80 corridor stretched east through darkness that felt less like freedom and more like exposure. Every set of headlights in his rearview mirror became a potential threat. Every vehicle that matched his speed for more than a few miles became something to analyze and worry about. The rational part of his brain knew this was paranoia, that the odds of being actively followed on a major interstate were minimal. The part of his brain that had received 2 threatening texts in the span of 3 hours disagreed loudly. He stopped for gas in Winnemucca around 2 a.m., pulling into a 24-hour truck plaza that felt simultaneously too exposed and not public enough. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he fueled the rental sedan, and every person who walked past became someone to catalog and assess. Man in his 50s, trucker, heading to his rig with a bag of food. Couple in their 20s, arguing quietly near a minivan. Woman alone, waiting by the pumps, checking her phone. None of them threats, all of them potential witnesses, and Boaz couldn't decide which mattered more. His phone rang as he was replacing the fuel cap. Unknown number, Nevada area code. Every instinct told him not to answer, let it go to voicemail, maintain distance. But the same instincts that had kept him alive at mile 92 also told him that ignoring problems didn't make them disappear. He answered on the 4th ring. "Mr. Cotterell." The voice was male, calm, professional. Not threatening exactly, but carrying an undertone that suggested threats wouldn't be necessary. "We need to have a conversation about tonight's events. A frank conversation between reasonable people who both understand the situation we find ourselves in." Boaz's grip tightened on the phone. "I don't know who you are, and I'm not interested in conversations." Everything I have to say goes through law enforcement or my attorney." A soft chuckle, genuinely amused. "Your attorney. That's good. That shows you're thinking clearly. But before you hang up and report this call, which I'm sure you will, let me offer you some context that might change how you approach the next few days. The cargo you were hauling tonight, it wasn't yours to discover. The people who arranged that cargo, they're not happy about the complications you've introduced. Now they could approach this situation aggressively, could view you as a problem that needs immediate resolution. Or they could recognize that you're just a working man who got caught in circumstances beyond his control, someone who might be willing to reconsider his level of cooperation with federal investigators." "I'm cooperating fully with the investigation," Boaz said, keeping his voice steady even as his heart hammered. "That's not going to change regardless of what threats you make." "Threats?" The voice carried genuine surprise. "Mr. Cotterill, I'm not threatening you. I'm offering you options. The texts you received tonight, those were sent by individuals who lack nuance, who think problems can be solved through intimidation. Those individuals have been corrected. You won't be receiving any more messages like that. What you will receive is space to think clearly about your situation. You're a trucker. You understand logistics. You understand that every action has downstream consequences. The question is whether those consequences affect just you, or whether they extend to other people in your life." The implication hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. Boaz thought about his ex-wife in Sacramento, his daughter in college in Oregon, his brother's family in Carson City. People he'd kept at arm's length for years, not out of malice but because the road didn't leave much room for close relationships. People who were now potentially vulnerable because of choices he'd made at mile 92. "You're talking about threatening my family." Boaz's voice had gone flat, drained of emotion. "You're telling me that if I testify or cooperate with the investigation, people I care about become targets." "I'm not telling you anything specific, Mr. Cotterill. I'm simply pointing out that your choices affect more than just yourself. That's true whether we're discussing cooperation with law enforcement or any other decisions you might make. Now, I'm going to disconnect this call. You're going to report it to Trooper Ellison or whoever else you've been coordinating with. They're going to trace the number, find it's a burner phone currently sitting in a trash can at a rest stop in Elko, and hit a dead end. And then you're going to think very carefully about what kind of testimony you're willing to provide, what kind of information you're willing to share, and whether protecting people who can't protect you is worth risking people who depend on you. Take your time. Think it through. We're patient people when patience serves our interests." The line went dead. Boaz stood by the rental car in the harsh fluorescent light of a Winnemucca truck plaza, phone still pressed to his ear, processing implications that felt like physical weight settling onto his shoulders. They knew about his family. They'd done research, built profiles, identified leverage points. This wasn't street-level crime, wasn't even organized crime in the traditional sense. This was something more sophisticated, more connected, more dangerous than he'd understood. He forwarded the call log to Trooper Ellison with a brief text. "Just received call from people behind the operation. Recording if possible, they mentioned my family." Then he got back in the rental car and drove, because sitting still felt like surrender, felt like giving them time to position their next move. The highway stretched ahead, empty in that deep night way, where you could go miles without seeing another vehicle. Boaz's mind churned through scenarios, through options, through calculations that all led to the same uncomfortable conclusion. He was exposed, vulnerable, caught between law enforcement that could offer protection but no guarantees, and criminals who could offer immunity but at costs he wasn't sure he could pay. His phone rang again, this time Trooper Ellison's number. Boaz answered immediately. "Mr. Cotterill, where are you right now?" Ellison's voice was tight, controlled urgency bleeding through professional calm. I-80 eastbound, just past Winnemucca. I got another call, different than the texts, someone who, I know, I got your message. Listen to me carefully. The people who called you, they're escalating faster than we anticipated. We've had 3 other truckers contact us tonight, all of them reporting similar approaches. All of them involved in routes through Nevada over the past 6 months. This isn't just about your load, Cotterell. This is a systematic operation, and you stumbling onto it has forced them to accelerate their damage control. We need you to come in. Let us put you somewhere secure while we sort through the implications. Secure like witness protection? Boaz heard the bitter laugh in his own voice. I'm a trucker, trooper. That's all I know, all I've ever known. You put me in witness protection, give me a new identity. What exactly am I supposed to do for work? Flip burgers? Stock shelves? I can't just stop being who I am because criminals want me to. I understand that, I do. But right now, your options are limited, and they're getting more limited by the hour. The people running this operation, they're not going to wait for a trial, not going to let this play out in court. They're going to try to resolve you as a problem before federal agents can build a case around your testimony. That means you need protection, whether you want it or not. Boaz stared at the white lines flickering past in his headlights, at the desert darkness that suddenly felt full of invisible observers, invisible threats. What if I don't testify? What if I tell the federal agents that I didn't see anything useful, didn't notice anything specific, can't provide details that would help their case? Would that be enough to make me not worth their attention? The pause on the other end lasted too long, and when Ellison spoke again, his voice carried a weight that confirmed what Boaz already knew. You're already in their system, Cotterell. You already reported the roadblock, already cooperated with the search, already gave statements. You can refuse to testify, but that doesn't erase what you've already done. And frankly, these people might not believe you've actually backed off. They might see any claims of non-cooperation as a tactical move, a way to lower their guard while the investigation continues. You're in this now, whether you want to be or not. The truth of it settled into Boaz's chest like cold stone. He'd done everything right at mile 92, trusted his instincts, made the correct choices, and those correct choices had painted a target on his back that wouldn't wash off. He thought about the man in the reflective vest, standing in the highway with professional calm. Thought about the dark SUV following him to Tonopah. Thought about the voice on the phone, offering options that weren't really options at all. Where do you want me to go? Boaz finally asked, voice hollowed out by exhaustion and resignation. There's a highway patrol station in Elko, about an hour ahead of you. I've already called ahead. They're expecting you. Pull in there. We'll coordinate with federal agents, and we'll figure out next steps. But Cotterell? Don't stop anywhere between Winnemucca and Elko. Don't make casual conversation with anyone. Don't deviate from the direct route. These people have shown they can mobilize quickly, and we don't know what kind of network they have monitoring the corridors. Just drive straight through and get to safety. Boaz agreed and disconnected, then pushed the rental car up to 75. Faster than he liked on unfamiliar roads, but slower felt like waiting for something bad to catch up. The highway unwound through darkness, and he found himself cataloging every vehicle he passed, every rest area, every possible ambush point. The paranoia he'd been fighting all night had shifted into something else, something more like tactical awareness, the mental state of someone who understood they were being hunted and couldn't afford to miss details. Mile marker 265 appeared in his headlights, then 270, then 275. Small towns flickered past, little more than clusters of lights in the desert darkness. Places that looked dead and empty at 3 a.m., but probably contained their own networks, their own watchers, their own people who noticed a rental sedan driving through at unusual hours. Boaz wondered how many of those people were just living normal lives, and how many might be part of the organization that wanted him silenced. Around mile marker 285, a vehicle pulled onto the highway behind him from what looked like a ranch access road, no lights initially, then headlights snapping on after it had already merged. Boaz's stomach clenched, and he watched the mirror as the vehicle accelerated to match his speed, maintaining a consistent distance of maybe 4 car lengths. Dark pickup, couldn't make out the model, couldn't see the plate, could be nothing. Could be exactly the kind of mobile surveillance Ellison had warned him about. He tested it by slowing to 65. The pickup slowed too, maintaining the same gap. He accelerated back to 75. The pickup matched him. Not closing the distance, not dropping back, just maintaining perfect separation like a professional tail. Boaz's hands tightened on the wheel, and he considered his options. He could call Ellison, report the tail, ask for guidance. He could try to lose the pickup, though his driving skills in a rental sedan versus someone who knew these roads was questionable. Or he could just maintain course, keep heading for Elko, and hope that the highway patrol station represented safety the pickup wouldn't challenge. He chose the third option, mostly because the other two felt like escalation, and escalation without knowing what he was escalating into seemed like a good way to make fatal mistakes. The pickup stayed behind him, constant and patient, and Boaz found himself checking the mirror every 10 seconds, watching for any change in behavior, any sign that the tail was about to become something more aggressive. Mile marker 295 brought the first scattered lights of Elko's outer edges, and the pickup maintained its position. Boaz followed the GPS directions to the highway patrol station, a low brick building set back from the main highway, well-lit parking lot with security cameras visible. The pickup continued past, as Boaz turned in, didn't slow, didn't acknowledge, just kept driving like it had never been following him at all. Boaz parked directly under a light pole, in full view of the security cameras, and sat for a moment trying to calm his breathing before he got out. The station's interior was standard law enforcement, institutional but functional. A desk sergeant looked up as Boaz entered, recognized him immediately from whatever bulletin had been sent ahead. "Mr. Cotterill, Trooper Ellison called, said you'd be arriving. There's a conference room in back where you can wait. Coffee's fresh, restrooms are down the hall. Federal agents are en route from Reno, should be here within the hour." Boaz nodded and followed directions to the conference room, a windowless space with a table, 6 chairs, and that peculiar emptiness that all official waiting rooms seem to share. He poured coffee from the pot on the side table, sat down, and tried to process the fact that his life had fundamentally changed in less than 12 hours. Last night, he'd been a professional trucker making a routine run. Now he was sitting in a highway patrol station waiting to discuss witness protection, being tailed by criminals, receiving threatening phone calls that mentioned his family. The federal agents arrived 50 minutes later, 2 of them, both carrying the kind of focused intensity that suggested they'd been working this case for longer than just tonight. They declined to give names, just identified themselves as federal investigators working the Interstate Trafficking Task Force. One was male, early 50s, with that weathered look that came from too many stakeouts and too much bad coffee. The other was female, younger, sharper, with eyes that assessed everything and gave away nothing. "Mr. Cotterill, we appreciate your cooperation," the male agent began, settling into a chair across from Boaz. "What happened tonight on US 95 has opened up an investigation we've been building for 8 months. The organization behind the cargo in your trailer, they're sophisticated, well-funded, and extremely cautious. Getting any kind of evidence against them has been nearly impossible. Your testimony, your willingness to recount what happened at mile 92 and afterward, that's potentially the break we need to build a prosecutable case." Trooper Ellison mentioned witness protection. Boaz said, not bothering with pleasantries. He mentioned that my testimony makes me a target, that these people might try to eliminate me before trial. I need to know what you're actually offering, what protection looks like, what happens to my life if I agree to testify. The female agent leaned forward slightly. Full witness protection, if it comes to that, means new identity, relocation, financial support during transition to a new career, ongoing security monitoring. It's comprehensive, but it's also permanent. You don't get to go back to being Boaz Cotterill once you enter WITSEC. Your old life ends, your new life begins, and maintaining that separation is critical to your safety. And if I don't want that? Boaz asked, though he already knew the answer. If I want to keep my name, keep my career, just live my life and testify when required? The agents exchanged a glance, and the male agent's expression hardened slightly. Then you're taking a significant risk. We can provide security during the trial, can monitor your movements, can respond to threats as they emerge. But we can't give you 24/7 protection indefinitely. And these people, Mr. Cotterill, they're patient. They'll wait months, even years, for the right opportunity to resolve problems. You testify without entering WITSEC. You're gambling that our case is strong enough to take down their entire operation before they can get to you. How strong is your case right now? Boaz needed to understand the variables, needed to know what his testimony actually meant in practical terms. With the cargo we seized from your trailer, with the individuals we detained in Tonopah, with the evidence we've been accumulating over 8 months? The female agent's expression suggested careful optimism. It's strong. Not bulletproof, not guaranteed convictions, but strong enough that we're confident about indictments. Your testimony adds the human element, the first-hand account of how they operate, the details that turn a cargo seizure into a conspiracy case. You're not the only piece, but you're an important one. Boaz thought about his apartment in Reno, about the roots he knew, about 11 years of building a career and a reputation in an industry that didn't forgive mistakes or failures. Thought about becoming someone else, learning new skills at 44 years old, starting over in a life that had no connection to everything he'd worked for. And he thought about his daughter, his ex-wife, his brother's family, people who would be told that Boaz Cotterill had disappeared, entered witness protection, was gone forever for his own safety. I need time to think about this, he said finally. I can't make this kind of decision at 4 a.m. after the night I've had. The agents nodded, professional understanding that still carried an edge of urgency. We understand, but Mr. Cotterill, the clock is ticking. The longer you're exposed, the more time these people have to plan their response. We'd like a decision within 48 hours, and we'd like you to stay in protective custody until you make that decision. Can you agree to that? Protective custody turned out to be a motel room in Elko. Nothing fancy but clean and secure, with an unmarked federal vehicle parked outside and agents rotating through 8-hour shifts. Boaz slept in fitful bursts, dreaming of roadblocks and dark SUVs, and voices offering options that weren't really options. When he woke around noon, his phone had accumulated more missed calls, more voicemails, more evidence that his life was spiraling into territory he didn't recognize. He spent the afternoon making calls, his dispatcher explaining that he needed extended time off, that the situation was complicated, that he'd provide details when he could. His ex-wife, having a conversation that started with "I'm not in trouble," and ended with, "Just be aware that some people might ask questions about me." His daughter, lying through his teeth about why he was calling out of the blue, why he sounded stressed, why he needed her to be careful about strangers asking questions. Each conversation peeled away another layer of his normal life, exposed another vulnerability. By evening, he'd made his decision. Not because he wanted to, but because the alternative was gambling with other people's safety, and that wasn't a bet he could stomach. He called the federal agents and told them he'd testify, told them he'd enter witness protection if that's what it took, told them to start the process, because waiting any longer just gave criminals more time to find him. The female agent's voice carried relief and approval. "You're making the right choice, Mr. Cotterell. It's not easy, but it's right. We'll begin the WITSEC application immediately, start coordinating with the Marshal Service, get you moved to a secure location while paperwork processes. You'll need to provide detailed statements, go through multiple interviews, help us build the strongest case possible. But you'll be safe, and the people you care about will be protected." Safe. The word felt hollow, felt like a promise that couldn't really be kept. But it was better than the alternative, better than waiting for a phone call in the middle of the night, better than wondering if every vehicle behind him on the highway was following him. Boaz packed his go bag one more time, preparing for another relocation, another stage of a journey that had started at mile 92 and seemed to have no clear ending. The federal agents arrived at the motel around 10 p.m., driving an unmarked sedan with tinted windows. They escorted Boaz out with professional efficiency, scanning the parking lot, moving quickly but not frantically. The drive to wherever they were taking him took 3 hours, winding through highways and back roads that Boaz tried to memorize, but eventually gave up on. They weren't telling him the destination, weren't providing details, just moving him from point A to point B with the kind of operational security that should have been reassuring but felt more isolating. The safe house turned out to be a ranch property outside of Battle Mountain, isolated enough that approach would be visible from a distance, secure enough that the perimeter had sensors and cameras. Boaz was introduced to the security team, 2 former military contractors who looked capable of handling threats, but hopefully wouldn't need to. The house itself was comfortable in that impersonal way of temporary housing. Furniture that had been selected for function rather than aesthetics. Appliances that worked, but showed their age. "You'll be here for approximately 2 weeks while we process your WITSEC application and prepare for grand jury testimony," the male agent explained, walking Boaz through the layout. "Communications are monitored and restricted. Phone calls go through us first. Internet access is filtered and logged. No social media. No reaching out to people from your old life. I know it feels restrictive, but every breach of protocol creates vulnerability, and we can't afford vulnerabilities right now." Boaz nodded, understanding intellectually while emotionally rebelling against the constraints. He'd spent his adult life on the road, independent, mobile, free to make his own choices and set his own schedule. This was the opposite of everything his career had represented. Confined, monitored, dependent on other people for his safety and his information about the outside world. The first week crawled past in a haze of interviews and statements. Federal agents rotated through, asking the same questions from different angles, building a comprehensive record of everything Boaz had witnessed, experienced, deduced. They wanted details about the loading depot in Reno, about his normal procedures, about anything unusual he might have noticed before the night of the incident. They wanted granular descriptions of the roadblock at mile 92, of the man in the reflective vest, of the SUV that followed him to Tonopah. They wanted his impressions, his interpretations, his gut feelings about what he'd seen. Some of it Boaz could provide with confidence. The layout of the roadblock, the position of the vehicle, the man's demeanor and appearance. Other questions exposed the limits of what he'd actually observed. The SUV's plate number, vehicle identification details, whether he'd seen weapons or noticed specific equipment. His memory was good but not perfect, and the agents pushed for precision that sometimes he just couldn't deliver. "That's normal," the female agent assured him during one particularly frustrating session. "You're not a trained observer. You were experiencing a crisis situation. Your brain was focused on survival, rather than cataloging evidence. What you remember is more than most witnesses could provide, and it's enough to build from. The second week brought different visitors. Marshal Service personnel began the WITSEC intake process, walking Boaz through the mechanics of identity change, relocation logistics, financial arrangements. They explained how his assets would be liquidated, how his debts would be settled, how he'd receive a new social security number, driver's license, birth certificate, the paperwork foundation of a life that had never existed before. "You'll need to choose a new name," one of the marshals explained, sliding a list of suggestions across the table. "We've pre-cleared these based on availability and background conflicts. Pick something you can remember naturally, something that feels comfortable. You'll be using it for the rest of your life." Boaz stared at the list, at names that belonged to strangers, at the clerical evidence of his old life's termination. He picked one at random, didn't matter which, because none of them were him. None of them were the person who'd spent 11 years building a reputation as a reliable trucker, who'd learned every mile of the Nevada corridors, who'd trusted his instincts at mile 92 and made choices that had led him to this sterile ranch house in the middle of nowhere. "What about my truck?" he asked suddenly, the question surprising even himself. "My rig, the Freightliner. I know it's evidence, I know you need it for the case, but after... what happens to it?" The marshal's expression shifted to something like sympathy. "It'll be held until after trial, then released. Your company will handle disposition, probably sell it or reassign it. You won't have access to it, Mr. Cotterell. That's part of the separation. Your old life, your old possessions, they stay behind." The finality of it hit harder than Boaz expected. That truck had been his home, his office, his constant companion for 3 years. He knew every rattle, every quirk, every sound it made under different conditions. Losing it felt like losing part of himself, another piece of identity stripped away by circumstances he hadn't chosen. On the 13th day, Trooper Creed Ellison visited the safe house, making the drive out from Tonopah to provide an update and check on Boaz's status. They sat on the ranch house's back porch, looking out over empty desert that stretched to distant mountains, and for a few minutes, neither spoke. Just two men watching wilderness that didn't care about criminal investigations or witness protection, or the complicated ways human lives got entangled. "The people we detained in Tonopah made bail," Ellison finally said, voice flat. $2 million each, paid in cash by an attorney we've never seen before. They walked out of county lockup 3 days ago, and we have no idea where they went. Ankle monitors were professionally removed within hours of release, probably had technical support waiting. We've issued warrants, circulated their information, but honestly..." He paused, shaking his head. "They're gone. Either out of state or out of the country, and they're not coming back until we don't matter anymore." Boaz absorbed that information without surprise. "So my testimony might not even matter. If the defendants are gone, if the case falls apart because key witnesses disappear, I gave up my life for nothing." "Your testimony still matters," Ellison countered, though his voice carried less conviction than Boaz would have liked. "We've got others in custody, lower-level operators who can't afford million-dollar bails. We've got evidence from your trailer, from other seizures, from surveillance we've been running for months. It's not perfect, but it's something. And Mr. Cotterell? The fact that they were willing to pay $4 million total to get those 2 specific individuals out of custody, that tells us something about how important they are to the operation. We're hurting them, even if we don't have them in cells anymore. Hurting them just makes them more motivated to hurt me back," Boaz pointed out. "I'm still the loose end, still the witness who can testify about what happened at mile 92. Doesn't matter if the specific defendants are in custody or not, as long as I'm alive and willing to talk, I'm a problem for them." Ellison didn't argue the point, because they both knew it was true. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph, laid it on the table between them. "We pulled this from traffic cameras on US 95, date stamped about 40 minutes before you encountered the roadblock at mile 92. Dark SUV matching the description you gave, no plates visible, traveling southbound at high speed. Can you confirm this is the vehicle that followed you to Tonopah?" Boaz studied the image, trying to see past the low resolution and bad angle. The SUV looked right, dark color, similar body style. But confirming it absolutely felt like another step deeper into testimony he wasn't sure he wanted to provide. Still, backing out now didn't make sense, not after everything he'd already committed to. "Could be," he said carefully. "I can't swear to it in court, but it looks consistent with what I saw." "That's good enough for now." Ellison retrieved the photo. "We're building the case piece by piece, Mr. Cotterill. Your testimony is part of it, but not the whole thing. You need to remember that. You're not solely responsible for whether this case succeeds or fails. You're just doing your part, telling the truth about what you experienced. The rest is on us, on the federal agents, on the prosecutors." The reassurance felt hollow, but Boaz appreciated the effort. He thought about the man who'd called him in Winnemucca, offering options that weren't really options. Wondered where that man was now, what he was planning, whether the organization was scrambling to contain the damage from the investigation, or calmly adapting like professionals who'd dealt with law enforcement complications before. "When do I testify?" Boaz asked. "When does this actually happen?" "Grand jury is scheduled for 3 weeks from now. After that, depending on indictments, trial could be anywhere from 6 months to 2 years out. A lot of variables, a lot of legal maneuvering. But your formal testimony, the official part where you're under oath and providing evidence, that starts in 3 weeks. Between now and then, you stay here, stay safe, and let us handle the logistics." 3 weeks in protective custody felt like eternity, but Boaz just nodded, because arguing wouldn't change the timeline. Ellison left an hour later, driving back toward Tonopah and his regular duties, leaving Boaz alone with security contractors and federal agents and the vast desert silence that pressed in from all sides. The days continued their monotonous crawl. Boaz read books from the Safe House's limited collection, watched carefully curated television that avoided local news, took walks around the property perimeter with security hovering at discreet distances. He thought constantly about his truck, about routes he'd driven, about the simple pleasure of making a delivery on schedule and moving on to the next load. All of it felt impossibly distant now, like memories from someone else's life. On the 18th day, alarms woke him at 3 a.m. Not loud, not panicked, just persistent electronic tones that brought security contractors moving through the house with weapons drawn and radio chatter crackling. Boaz was hustled into an interior room, no windows, reinforced door, the kind of space designed for exactly this scenario. He sat on the floor in darkness while boots moved above him, and voices coordinated response to whatever had triggered the perimeter sensors. 40 minutes passed before the all-clear came. The male federal agent who'd interviewed him multiple times appeared in the doorway, expression carefully neutral. "We had a vehicle approach along the western access road, slow roll past the property line, then departure without stopping. Could be ranchers checking on something, could be criminals conducting reconnaissance. Security cameras got footage, we'll analyze it, but this demonstrates exactly why protective custody is necessary. They're looking for you, Mr. Cotterill. They're actively trying to locate you." The adrenaline crash left Boaz shaking, sitting on the floor of a safe room in a house he'd never chosen, protected by people he barely knew from threats he couldn't quantify. This was his life now. This was what doing the right thing at mile 92 had cost him. Safety purchased at the price of freedom, security that felt like a different kind of prison. He didn't sleep the rest of that night. Just sat watching the sun come up through a small window, thinking about choices and consequences, about whether he'd make the same decisions if he could go back to that moment on US 95, approaching a roadblock that changed everything. He wanted to believe he'd still bypass it, still call authorities, still do the right thing. But sitting in a safe house at dawn after 3 weeks of protective custody, he honestly wasn't sure anymore. The final week before grand jury testimony brought renewed intensity to the interviews. Federal prosecutors joined the sessions, drilling Boaz on specific details, preparing him for questions he'd face under oath, identifying potential weaknesses in his account that defense attorneys might exploit. They were professional, thorough, and ruthlessly focused on building a case strong enough to secure indictments against multiple defendants. "You're going to be challenged on your decision to bypass the roadblock," one prosecutor warned him. "Defense will argue you could have stopped safely, that you endangered the suspects by driving aggressively, that your actions precipitated everything that followed. You need to be clear, confident, and consistent about why you made that choice. Walk us through your thinking again." Boaz recounted it for what felt like the 100th time. The positioning of the vehicle, the man's demeanor, the absence of typical breakdown indicators, the instinct that something was wrong. He'd told the story so many times it almost felt rehearsed now, stripped of genuine emotion, just facts delivered in sequence. The prosecutors nodded, took notes, asked follow-up questions designed to expose any inconsistencies or uncertainties. "You'll do fine," the female prosecutor assured him after one particularly grueling session. "You're believable, you're detailed, you're clearly just a regular person caught in extraordinary circumstances. Juries respond to that authenticity. Grand jury will too." 2 days before the scheduled testimony, they moved Boaz again, this time to a secure federal building in Reno, closer to the courthouse where the grand jury would convene. The facility was designed for protected witnesses, with multiple layers of security and protocols that made the ranch house seem casual by comparison. Boaz's world had shrunk to a series of secure rooms and escorted movements, every step monitored, every interaction controlled. The night before testimony, he couldn't sleep despite exhaustion. Lay in the unfamiliar bed thinking about the morning ahead, about sitting in front of strangers and recounting the worst night of his professional life, about swearing to tell the truth while lawyers picked apart every word for weaknesses and inconsistencies. He thought about the voice on the phone in Winnemucca, offering options, about the dark SUV rolling past the safe house at 3 a.m., about all the ways this could still go wrong, even after he'd done everything right. Morning came too quickly. Federal marshals escorted him through underground parking, into an armored vehicle, through routes designed to prevent surveillance or interception. The courthouse was fortress-like, multiple security checkpoints, metal detectors, armed guards. Boaz was walked through back corridors to a waiting room, where prosecutors gave him final instructions and encouragement. "Just tell your story," they said. "Answer questions honestly. If you don't know something, say so. Don't speculate, don't elaborate beyond what you witnessed. You'll be fine." The grand jury room was smaller than he expected, 23 citizens sitting in tiered seating, looking at him with expressions ranging from curious to skeptical to bored. The prosecutor guided him through his testimony with prepared questions, establishing timeline and context and specific details. Boaz spoke clearly, methodically, maintaining eye contact, doing everything he'd been coached to do. When he described the roadblock at mile 92, described the decision to bypass it, he saw several jurors lean forward, paying closer attention. When he recounted the SUV following him to Tonopah, the threatening phone calls, the cargo discovered in his trailer, their expressions shifted to something like concern, or perhaps recognition, that this was more serious than typical criminal cases they'd heard. The testimony lasted 3 hours. Questions and answers, clarifications and confirmations, building a record that would either lead to indictments or wouldn't. When it finally concluded, Boaz was escorted back to the secure facility, exhausted and wrung out, uncertain whether he'd done enough, whether his account had been persuasive, whether any of this would matter in the end. The indictments came down 2 days later, 15 defendants, charges ranging from interstate trafficking to criminal conspiracy to weapons violations. Not everyone connected to the organization, but enough to disrupt their operations, enough to justify the resources that had been invested in the investigation. Boaz's testimony had been part of the evidence package that secured those indictments, and the prosecutors called to congratulate him and thank him for his cooperation. It felt emptier than it should have. 15 indictments, but the 2 people detained in Tonopah weren't among them, had disappeared after making bail. The voice on the phone in Winnemucca belonged to someone who'd never been identified. The organization's leadership remained insulated, protected by layers of deniability and cutouts. They'd won a battle, maybe, but the war felt far from over. "When do I get my new life?" Boaz asked the marshal coordinating his WITSEC transition. "When does Boaz Cotterill disappear and whoever I'm becoming takes over?" "Paperwork's nearly complete," the marshal replied. "Another week for final processing, background establishment, asset liquidation. Then we relocate you to your new city, set you up with housing and employment assistance, and you start over. It's not easy, Mr. Cotterill. A lot of people struggle with the transition, but it's the price of safety, and right now, safety is what keeps you alive." The new identity arrived in a manila envelope, delivered by a marshal who treated it like classified documents, which, in a sense, they were. Social Security card, driver's license, birth certificate, employment history, educational records, credit report. The complete documentation of a life that had never been lived by a person who'd never existed until 3 federal agencies decided he should. Boaz stared at the name on the license, at the face that was his own but attached to someone else's biography, and felt the last threads of his old life finally sever. "You'll need to memorize everything," the marshal instructed, spreading the documents across the table in the secure facility's conference room. "Birth date, previous addresses, employment history, all of it. This isn't just paperwork, it's your backstory. Anyone who runs a background check needs to find a consistent, believable history. That means you need to live this identity completely, never slip, never reference your old life even in casual conversation." The employment history showed a progression through various logistics and warehouse jobs. Nothing that would raise questions, but enough to justify his skill set. The address history moved him through several Midwestern cities, places Boaz had never visited, neighborhoods he couldn't describe if someone asked. The educational background was minimal: high school diploma, some community college, nothing that would require detailed knowledge or alumni connections. It was a carefully constructed identity designed to be forgettable, the kind of life that blended into background noise and attracted no special attention. "Where am I being relocated?" Boaz asked, though part of him didn't want to know, didn't want to make the destination real until he absolutely had to. "Pueblo, Colorado," the marshal replied. "Mid-sized city, diverse economy, enough transient population that a new face doesn't raise immediate questions. We've arranged temporary housing and connected you with employment services that work with our program. You won't be driving trucks anymore, Mr. Cotterill. That career ended at mile 92. But we've identified positions in warehouse operations, shipping logistics, dock work, things that use your skills without putting you on the road where you'd be visible and vulnerable." Not driving anymore. The reality of it settled into Boaz's chest like lead. 11 years of building a career, developing a reputation, learning routes and procedures, and the thousand small details that separated good truckers from mediocre ones. All of it meaningless now, erased by the necessity of disappearance. He'd become someone who'd never hauled freight, never driven through Nevada deserts at 3 a.m., never encountered a roadblock at mile 92 that changed everything. What about my family? The question came out quieter than Boaz intended. My daughter, my ex-wife, my brother. What do they get told? The marshal's expression shifted to something like sympathy, though it remained professionally controlled. They'll be informed that you've entered witness protection, that you can't contact them, that for everyone's safety, the separation needs to be complete. It's difficult, Mr. Cotterill. I won't pretend otherwise. But maintaining that separation is what keeps them safe and keeps you alive. Any contact, any attempt to reach out, creates vulnerability that can be exploited. Boaz thought about his daughter, 22 years old, finishing her senior year at Oregon State. Thought about the last conversation they'd had, 3 weeks ago from the ranch house, him lying about why he sounded stressed, why he needed her to be careful. She'd probably been confused, probably wondered what was wrong, probably worried in that way children worry about parents even when they're adults themselves. And now she'd be told he was gone, disappeared into witness protection, unreachable indefinitely. No goodbye, no explanation, just absence. Can I write letters? Boaz heard the desperate edge in his own voice. Something they'd receive after I'm relocated. Something that explains, that tells them I'm okay? Letters create paper trails, the marshal said, not unkindly. They can be traced, intercepted, analyzed for clues about your location or situation. The safest approach is complete separation, no contact of any kind. I know that's hard to hear, but it's the reality of witness protection. You're choosing survival, and survival requires sacrifice. The word felt inadequate for what he was losing. This wasn't sacrifice, wasn't noble self-denial for a greater good. This was amputation, cutting away pieces of identity and connection and history because keeping them would be fatal. Boaz looked at the documents spread across the table, at the stranger's life he was expected to inhabit, and wondered if survival at this cost was really worth it. But the alternative was worse. The alternative was waiting for criminals to find him, waiting for a phone call in the middle of the night, waiting for violence that would come eventually, because he'd seen too much and testified too honestly. So he memorized the new identity, repeated the biographical details until they felt almost natural, and prepared for relocation to a city he'd never visited to start a life he'd never chosen. The move happened fast, orchestrated with the kind of operational precision that suggested the Marshal Service had done this thousands of times before. Boaz was driven to a private airfield outside Reno, flown to Colorado Springs on a chartered plane with no passenger manifest, then driven to Pueblo in an unmarked vehicle with tinted windows. His possessions fit in 2 duffel bags, everything else from his old life liquidated or left behind. Clothes, basic toiletries, a few books, nothing with sentimental value because sentiment created attachment, and attachment created vulnerability. The apartment they'd arranged was in a complex on Pueblo's north side, ground floor unit with parking directly outside, 2 bedrooms though he'd only need 1. Furnished with generic items that looked like they'd been selected from a catalog. Functional but impersonal, the kind of space that hundreds of people could inhabit without leaving any distinctive mark. The marshal who'd escorted him did a walkthrough, pointing out security features and emergency protocols, then handed over keys and a phone number that would reach the local WITSEC coordinator if problems arose. "You're on your own now," the marshal said, not unkindly. "We'll check in monthly, run background sweeps, to make sure you're staying clean and staying safe. But the daily work of being your new identity, that's on you. Remember your training, trust your instincts, and if something feels wrong, call us immediately. Don't try to handle threats yourself. Don't try to investigate suspicious activity. You're a protected witness, not law enforcement. Your job is to stay alive and stay invisible." Then the marshal left, and Boaz was alone in a stranger's apartment in a city he didn't know, carrying a name that didn't feel like his own, facing a future that looked nothing like the life he'd been building for 44 years. He stood in the living room for a long time, just looking at the generic furniture and blank walls, trying to imagine himself living here, existing here, being whoever the document said he was. It felt impossible. Felt like a role he couldn't sustain, but he didn't have alternatives that kept him breathing. The Employment Services Office was downtown, a nonprofit that worked with various populations needing job placement assistance. They'd been briefed on his situation in whatever carefully sanitized way the Marshal's Service handled such things, knew he needed work but couldn't provide detailed references or employment history beyond what the manufactured documents showed. The counselor assigned to his case was a woman in her 30s, professional but warm, clearly experienced in working with people who had complicated backgrounds. "We've got several positions that might be appropriate," she said, pulling up listings on her computer. "Warehouse work at a distribution center, forklift operator at a manufacturing plant, dock supervisor at a freight terminal. All of them entry-level despite your experience, because we can't verify your actual employment history. You'd need to start low and work your way up based on performance rather than resume." Boaz chose the freight terminal position, partly because it felt closest to his old life, partly because dock work meant staying stationary rather than driving routes that might take him back toward Nevada and visibility. The pay was less than half what he'd made as a trucker, barely enough to cover rent and basic expenses, but survival wasn't about comfort anymore. It was about maintenance, about keeping his new identity functional and his real identity buried. Training started the following Monday. The terminal was a sprawling facility on Pueblo's industrial south side. Concrete and steel and diesel exhaust, the familiar environment of freight operations that should have felt like home but instead felt like mockery. Boaz worked alongside people half his age, learning procedures he already knew, following protocols he'd been executing for 11 years, all while pretending this was new information. The physical labor was harder than he remembered, or maybe he was just older, more worn down by stress and relocation and the constant low-grade vigilance of living under threat. His coworkers were friendly enough, asked the usual new employee questions about where he'd moved from, what brought him to Pueblo, whether he had family in the area. Boaz delivered the rehearsed answers with what he hoped was casual naturalness, maintaining the manufactured backstory, offering no details that might invite follow-up questions or curiosity. Most people accepted his responses at face value, showed polite interest, then moved on to other topics. A few seemed to sense something off about him, something that didn't quite add up, but they didn't push, respected whatever boundaries they detected. The work rhythm established itself over weeks. Morning shift starting at 6 a.m., 8 hours of loading and unloading trucks, processing freight, managing inventory systems. Physical exhaustion that should have helped him sleep, but somehow didn't. Evenings alone in the generic apartment, watching television he didn't care about, eating meals that tasted like cardboard, existing in a liminal state between the life that had ended and a life that didn't feel real yet. The monthly check-ins with the WITSEC coordinator confirmed he was maintaining his cover, staying out of trouble, exhibiting no behaviors that might compromise his security. 3 months into his new existence, Boaz was working the loading dock when a long-haul rig pulled in, Freightliner Cascadia with Nevada plates, and the sight of it hit him like physical impact. For a moment, he was back on US 95, approaching mile 92, making the split-second decision that had led to everything that followed. The trucker who climbed down from the cab was younger than Boaz, late 20s maybe, with that particular alertness that long-distance drivers developed. He stretched, scanned the dock, caught Boaz watching and nodded acknowledgement. Boaz nodded back and turned away before conversation could start, before the trucker might mention routes or ask questions about Boaz's own driving experience. The ache of loss was sudden and overwhelming, recognition of everything he'd given up, everything that had been taken from him. He'd been good at trucking, had taken pride in his professionalism, his reliability, his knowledge of the routes he ran, and now he was loading someone else's freight, helping facilitate deliveries he'd never make, watching other drivers live the career he'd lost. The dock supervisor noticed his distraction. "You okay? Look like you've seen a ghost." "Just tired," Boaz said, which wasn't technically a lie. He was tired, exhausted in ways that sleep couldn't fix, worn down by the constant performance of being someone he wasn't. But admitting that would invite questions he couldn't answer, so he just returned to work, moving freight with mechanical efficiency, while his mind drifted to highways he'd never drive again. That evening, back in the apartment, Boaz made a decision he knew was probably stupid, but couldn't stop himself from implementing. He opened his laptop, navigated to a trucker forum he'd occasionally visited before witness protection, just to read. Not to post, not to interact, just to lurk and absorb the conversation, the familiar complaints about traffic and fuel prices and dispatcher incompetence, the shared experience of a community he'd been forced to abandon. The discussions were mundane, comforting in their ordinariness. Someone asking about the best truck stops on I-40 through Arizona. Someone else venting about a shipper who'd kept them waiting for hours at the loading dock. A thread about new ELD regulations and how they affected logbook management. Normal trucking concerns, the daily texture of a life Boaz couldn't live anymore. He was about to close the laptop when a username caught his eye. Highway Ghost 95. The number made his breath catch, made him click on the profile against every instinct that said this was dangerous, said he needed to maintain distance from anything connected to his old life. The account had been created 2 weeks ago, had made exactly 3 posts, all of them in threads about Nevada routes, about Highway 50 and US 95, about the long empty stretches between Reno and Tonopah. The posts themselves were innocuous, just another driver discussing routes and conditions. But something about the username, about the specific reference to 95, about the timing of the account creation, made Boaz's stomach clench with recognition. This wasn't coincidence. This was a message, a signal, someone telling him they knew he was out there watching, knew he hadn't completely disconnected from his old community. He closed the laptop without logging out, without clearing browser history, just shut it down like that would somehow undo what he'd seen. His hands were shaking slightly, adrenaline response to perceived threat, body remembering the fear even if his mind tried to rationalize it away. Maybe Highway Ghost 95 was just a random username, just another driver who happened to like that particular route. Maybe he was seeing patterns where none existed, letting paranoia transform innocuous coincidence into sinister implication. But Boaz had trusted his instincts at mile 92, and those instincts had kept him alive. And right now, those same instincts were screaming that the forum account wasn't random, wasn't innocent, was exactly what it appeared to be. Evidence that someone was looking for him, probing the spaces where he might still maintain connection to his old life, watching for any sign that Boaz Cotterill still existed somewhere beneath whatever new identity he'd assumed. He should call the WITSEC coordinator immediately, report the potential security breach, let professionals assess whether this was genuine threat or paranoid interpretation. But calling meant admitting he'd been visiting trucker forums, meant acknowledging he'd violated the separation protocols, meant potentially losing what little connection he still had to the life he'd been forced to abandon. So instead, he sat in the dark apartment, laptop closed, phone untouched, trying to convince himself he was overreacting while simultaneously knowing he wasn't. Sleep was impossible that night. Boaz lay in bed watching shadows move across the ceiling, listening to the ambient noise of the apartment complex, the distant traffic from the nearby highway, the everyday sounds of normal life continuing around him, while his own existence felt increasingly precarious. By morning, exhaustion and daylight had combined to make the form account feel less threatening, just paranoia amplified by isolation and stress. He went to work, loaded freight, maintained his cover, told himself everything was fine. 3 days later, a new rig appeared at the terminal. Not unusual, the facility handled dozens of trucks daily, but this one arrived during a quiet afternoon shift when most scheduled deliveries had already been processed. Dark blue Peterbilt, Nevada plates, driver who stayed in the cab longer than normal before climbing down. When he finally emerged, Boaz was 20 yards away, moving freight with a hand truck, but close enough to see the driver's face. Close enough to feel recognition spike through him like electric shock. It was the man from mile 92. The man in the reflective vest who'd stood in the middle of US 95 flagging trucks down, whose expression had shifted from professional to something harder when Boaz had refused to stop. Older than Boaz remembered, or maybe just more worn down by whatever life he'd been living since that night. But unmistakably the same person, now standing on a loading dock in Pueblo, Colorado, 3 months after Boaz had testified to a grand jury about encountering him at a staged roadblock. Their eyes met across the dock space, and Boaz saw the exact moment recognition registered. The man didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't acknowledge Boaz in any obvious way. He just held the eye contact for a beat longer than natural, then turned and walked back to his truck, climbed in, fired the engine, and pulled out of the facility without dropping off or picking up any freight. The entire interaction had taken maybe 90 seconds, but its meaning was absolutely clear. They'd found him. Despite witness protection, despite the new identity, despite every security protocol designed to keep protected witnesses invisible, the organization had located him, tracked him to Pueblo, confirmed his presence. And they'd sent someone to let him know they knew, to demonstrate that separation and relocation meant nothing if you had sufficient resources and motivation. Boaz set down the hand truck with careful precision, walked to the dock supervisor's office, and told him he felt sick and needed to leave early. The supervisor took one look at his face and agreed without argument. Boaz drove back to the apartment with his hands locked on the wheel, checking mirrors constantly, watching for the dark blue Peterbilt or any other vehicle that might be following him. The parking lot outside his building looked normal, unthreatening, but normal didn't mean safe anymore. Inside the apartment, he finally called the WITSEC coordinator, a number he'd been given for emergencies and told to use only when absolutely necessary. The call connected to voicemail, asked him to leave a message, promised return call within 2 hours. Boaz hung up without speaking, then immediately dialed Trooper Creed Ellison's direct line, the business card he'd been given months ago, the contact he probably shouldn't be using because it connected his new life to his old identity. Ellison answered on the third ring. "Trooper Ellison." "It's Boaz Cotterell," he said, using his real name deliberately, claiming his actual identity in a moment of crisis. "They found me. The man from mile 92. He was at my work location 30 minutes ago in Pueblo. He saw me, I saw him. We both knew exactly what was happening. Witness protection is compromised." The silence on the other end lasted 3 seconds that felt like hours. Then Ellison's voice came back, harder and more focused. "You're certain it was the same individual?" "Absolutely certain. Same face, same build, same expression when he recognized me. He didn't approach, didn't threaten, just made eye contact and left. But the message was clear. They know where I am. They know what name I'm using. They've penetrated whatever security was supposed to keep me hidden." "Where are you now?" "My apartment. Pueblo North Side. The address the Marshal Service set up. I called the WITSEC coordinator, got voicemail, decided I needed to talk to someone immediately. Stay inside. Lock your doors. Don't open them for anyone you don't recognize. I'm going to make some calls. Coordinate with federal agents and the Marshal Service. This is a serious breach, Cotterill. If they've found you, if they've confirmed your location, witness protection protocols have failed fundamentally. We need to get you relocated again, get you somewhere secure while we figure out how they penetrated your cover." Boaz thought about another relocation, another city, another manufactured identity, another starting over. The prospect felt suffocating, felt like infinite regression, where he'd spend the rest of his life running from people who had demonstrated they could always find him. What if I don't want to relocate again? What if I'm done running, done hiding, done living as someone I'm not? "Then you die," Ellison said bluntly. "I'm not trying to be dramatic, I'm stating facts. These people have invested significant resources in finding you, have demonstrated sophisticated surveillance capabilities, have compromised federal protection protocols. You're not safe in Pueblo, won't be safe wherever you go next, won't be safe until everyone involved in the organization is in custody or dead. And that might be years away, might be never. So your choices are relocate and live, or stay, and wait for them to finish what they started." The brutal honesty should have been frightening. Instead, Boaz felt strange calm settle over him, the kind of clarity that came from finally understanding the full scope of your situation. "How did they find me? What failed in the security protocols?" "I don't know yet, but we'll investigate. Could be someone inside the Marshal Service compromised. Could be they tracked financial transactions or employment records. Could be they got lucky and spotted you, randomly then confirmed identity. We'll figure it out. But right now, the how matters less than the what. What matters is you're exposed, you're vulnerable, and you need protection immediately." Boaz stood in the generic apartment, looking at the manufactured life he'd been inhabiting for 3 months, and felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down. He could accept relocation, could run again, could spend decades moving from place to place every time the organization located him, living in fear and isolation until he died of old age, or they finally succeeded in eliminating him. Or he could refuse, could reclaim his real identity, could force some kind of confrontation that at least put him on offensive footing rather than perpetual defense. "I need time to think," he said finally. "Give me 24 hours to process this, to figure out what I want to do. Don't send marshals to extract me yet. Don't initiate protocols. Just give me 1 day to make peace with my options." Ellison's hesitation was audible. "Cotterill, I can't in good conscience give you time when the threat is immediate. These people might be positioning for an operation right now, might be planning to move on you tonight. Waiting is dangerous." "Everything is dangerous," Boaz countered. "Staying is dangerous. Running is dangerous. Testifying was dangerous. Doing the right thing at mile 92 was dangerous. I've been living with danger for months, and I'm tired of other people making my decisions for me. 24 hours. That's what I'm asking. Then I'll coordinate with whatever authorities you want, accept whatever security measures you recommend. But I need 1 day to think without being rushed into action." The pause stretched. Then Ellison sighed. 24 hours. But Cotterill, if you see anything suspicious, anyone approaching your location, any indication they're moving on you, You call 911 immediately, and then you call me. Don't try to handle this yourself. Don't try to negotiate or reason with these people. They're not interested in conversation, only in resolving you as a problem. Understand?" Boaz agreed and disconnected, then sat on the generic couch in the generic living room and thought about the trajectory of his life since that night on US 95. Every choice he'd made had been correct, every decision rational and justified. Stop at the roadblock or bypass it. Bypass was right. Call authorities or try to handle it privately. Authorities was right. Cooperate with investigation or refuse. Cooperation was right. Enter witness protection or take chances with inadequate security. Protection was right. And yet here he was, found by the very people he'd been protected from, living a half-life under a false identity in a city he didn't know, cut off from family and career and everything that had made him who he was. The right choices had led to wrong outcomes, and now he faced more impossible decisions where both options led to different versions of the same bad ending. He thought about his daughter, about the conversations they'd never have, the milestones he'd miss, the grandchildren he might never meet. Thought about his truck, the Freightliner Cascadia sitting in some federal impound lot, gathering dust while other drivers lived the career he'd lost. Thought about Highway 50, about the loneliness of Nevada deserts, about the simple pleasure of making deliveries on schedule and moving on to the next load. All of it gone, sacrificed for the principle of doing the right thing, for trusting that authorities could protect people who cooperated with investigations. Night fell over Pueblo, and Boaz sat in darkness, not turning on lights, not watching television, just existing in the space between identities, between lives, between the person he'd been and the person they wanted him to become. His phone stayed silent. No calls from the WITSEC coordinator, no follow-up from Ellison, just quiet that felt less peaceful than ominous. Around 2 a.m., unable to sleep, Boaz made a decision that probably violated every protocol he'd been given. He opened his laptop, navigated back to the trucker forum, found the Highway Ghost 95 account, and sent a direct message. Just 3 words. Mile 92. Talk? The response came within 5 minutes, which meant whoever monitored that account was watching constantly, waiting for exactly this kind of outreach. The message was brief, contained only an address in Industrial Pueblo, and a time, 4 p.m. tomorrow. No threats, no demands, just coordinates for a meeting that Boaz knew he shouldn't attend, knew was probably a trap, knew represented everything law enforcement had warned him against. But continuing to run felt unsustainable, felt like slow death by 1,000 relocations and false identities. Meeting might be dangerous, might be stupid, might get him killed. But at least it was action rather than reaction. At least it put him in the position of making choices rather than having choices made for him. He confirmed the meeting time, closed the laptop, and tried to sleep, knowing tomorrow would either resolve his situation or end it permanently. The industrial address turned out to be a closed trucking depot, chain-link fence surrounding empty lots where rigs used to park, office building with plywood over the windows, the kind of abandoned commercial property that dotted every American city. Boaz arrived at 3:45 p.m., circling the perimeter twice before committing to entry, checking for obvious surveillance or threat indicators. Everything looked abandoned, looked empty, but empty didn't mean safe. He parked near the main gate, left the engine running, kept his phone in hand with 911 pre-dialed, ready to call for help if the situation deteriorated. The gate wasn't locked, just closed, and it swung open with a rusty groan that echoed across the empty lot. Boaz walked toward the office building, every nerve firing, every instinct screaming that this was a mistake, that he should turn back, call Ellison, accept relocation and protection, and all the security protocols he'd been provided. A figure emerged from the building's shadows, and Boaz recognized him immediately. Not the man from mile 92, not the trucker who'd appeared at his work location, but someone else entirely. Older, maybe 60, dressed in expensive casual clothes that looked wrong in this industrial setting, carrying himself with the calm authority of someone accustomed to control. He approached to within 10 feet and stopped, maintaining distance, hands visible, posture non-threatening but radiating confidence. "Mr. Cotterill, thank you for meeting me. I know this violates your security protocols. I know your law enforcement contacts would disapprove strongly, but I wanted to offer you a conversation that those contacts can't provide, one that acknowledges realities they prefer to ignore." "You're the one who called me in Winnemucca," Boaz said, recognizing the voice, the cadence, the careful diction that suggested education and sophistication. "You're part of the organization behind the cargo in my trailer." I prefer to think of myself as someone who facilitates certain business operations that exist outside conventional regulatory frameworks, the man replied with a slight smile. "But yes, I represent the interests you inadvertently disrupted at mile 92, interests that would very much like to resolve the complications you've created." "By killing me," Boaz kept his voice flat, stating facts rather than accusations. "By finding a mutually acceptable solution that serves everyone's interests better than current arrangements. You're in witness protection, Mr. Cotterill, but protection hasn't protected you. You're living under a false identity in a city you don't know, cut off from family and career, existing in constant fear that we'll locate you, which, as you've seen, we can do whenever we choose. That's not living. That's just delayed dying. So what's your offer? What mutually acceptable solution involves me staying alive?" The man clasped his hands behind his back, considering his response carefully. "You testified to a grand jury, helped secure 15 indictments against individuals who were, frankly, expendable to our operations. Low-level operators who can be replaced with minimal disruption. The people those indictments actually threaten. They're not present in any courtroom, not worried about prosecution, not vulnerable to the case your testimony helped build. You've done your civic duty, Mr. Cotterill. You've cooperated with authorities, provided information, satisfied whatever moral obligation you felt about doing the right thing, and it hasn't made you safer, hasn't improved your situation, hasn't accomplished anything except destroying your life. Get to the point." Boaz's hands clenched at his sides, frustration bleeding through despite his effort to maintain neutral demeanor. "The point is this. The trial phase is still months away, might be years before cases actually conclude. Your testimony at trial would be more detailed than your grand jury statement, more damaging to our operations, more problematic for everyone involved. We'd like to prevent that testimony from occurring, but not through methods that would attract additional law enforcement attention or create martyrs that prosecutors could exploit. So we're offering you an alternative. Walk away from witness protection, reclaim your real identity, return to trucking, or whatever life you want to rebuild. We'll leave you alone, won't pursue retaliation, won't involve your family. In exchange, when trial dates arrive, you discover you can't remember details clearly. You're uncertain about identifications. You're not a reliable witness, after all. Cases fall apart from lack of evidence and everyone moves forward." The offer hung in the air between them, simultaneously tempting and repulsive. Everything Boaz wanted, his life back, his identity restored, his freedom from constant relocation and fear, purchased at the cost of perjury and betrayal of the investigation he'd supported. He thought about the federal agents who'd worked the case, about Trooper Ellison who'd responded to his call, about all the resources and effort invested in building prosecutions that his testimony would help confirm. You're asking me to commit perjury, to throw the cases, to let criminals walk free, because you've demonstrated you can find me whenever you want. I'm asking you to prioritize your own survival over abstract concepts of justice that clearly aren't serving your interests. The people who'd be affected by failed prosecutions, they're not good people, Mr. Cotterill. But they're also not the worst people. They're businessmen operating in gray markets, facilitating transactions between willing parties, providing services that significant populations desire. The harm they cause is debatable, the good they prevent is questionable, and the resources spent prosecuting them might be better deployed elsewhere. You refusing to testify clearly doesn't make you a villain. It makes you someone who reevaluated his priorities and decided survival mattered more than helping prosecute ambiguous crimes. Boaz stared at the man, at the sophisticated rationalization, at the offer that was simultaneously an ultimatum. Accept and live with the knowledge that he'd betrayed everyone who'd tried to help him, that he'd let criminals escape consequences, that his principles were negotiable when sufficient pressure applied. Refuse and continue running, continue relocating, continue living half-lives under false identities, until the organization eventually succeeded in eliminating him, or until time and stress destroyed him anyway. I need to think about this, Boaz said, voice hollow. This isn't a decision I can make, standing in an abandoned trucking depot talking to someone whose name I don't even know. Of course, take your time. Consider your options carefully. But Mr. Cotterill, understand that time has limits. Trial dates will be set eventually, prosecutors will begin preparing their cases, and opportunities for elegant solutions diminish as proceedings advance. We'd prefer to resolve this through conversation rather than confrontation, but we're prepared for either outcome. Contact will be made again in 1 week, same method as before. You'll provide your decision then, and we'll proceed accordingly. The man turned and walked back toward the office building, disappeared into shadows without looking back, confident in his position, certain that Boaz understood the calculation. And he did understood perfectly the choice being offered. Betray principles and live, or maintain integrity and die. Simple, brutal, clarified in ways that law enforcement's careful protocols and witness protection's elaborate security theater could never match. Boaz returned to his car, hands shaking slightly as he started the engine, drove back toward the apartment while his mind churned through implications and consequences. He should call Ellison immediately, report the contact, describe the offer, let authorities decide how to proceed. That was protocol, that was procedure, that was what protected witnesses were supposed to do when contacted by the organizations they'd testified against. Instead, he drove past the apartment complex, continued south toward the highway that connected Pueblo to wider Colorado and broader America. Drove without destination, just motion, just the familiar rhythm of wheels on asphalt and white lines flickering past. Found himself on I-25 heading north, then west on US 50, and realized with strange inevitability that he was driving toward Nevada, toward the desert corridors he'd hauled freight through for 11 years, toward the landscape that had shaped his career and destroyed his life. It took him 3 days to reach US 95, 3 days of driving in a rental car that wasn't his truck, stopping at rest areas that felt simultaneously familiar and alien, existing in the liminal space between identities. He didn't call Ellison, didn't contact the WITSEC coordinator, didn't inform anyone of his movements, just drove, because driving was what he knew, what he'd always known, the one constant in a life that had become unrecognizable. Mile marker 92 looked unchanged, looked exactly as it had that night in October when Boaz had approached a roadblock and made choices that led to everything afterward. The highway stretched empty in both directions, sage and scrub extending to distant mountains. Nevada desert, indifferent to human drama. Boaz pulled onto the shoulder, killed the engine, and got out, standing on the same asphalt where the man in the reflective vest had flagged traffic with professional precision. He thought about that moment, about the split-second decision to bypass rather than stop, about trusting instincts that had proven correct but costly. Thought about everything that had followed. The chase to Tonopah, the federal investigation, the witness protection, the relocation, the confrontation in the abandoned trucking depot. All of it traceable back to this stretch of highway, to choices made under pressure with incomplete information. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of orange and red that looked almost beautiful in their indifference. Boaz stood watching light fade, watching darkness reclaim the landscape, feeling the weight of decisions he still needed to make. Accept the organization's offer and reclaim his life through betrayal, or refuse and continue the endless flight that witness protection represented. Neither option was good. Neither option returned him to the person he'd been before mile 92. Neither option restored what he'd lost. In the gathering darkness, Boaz heard an engine approaching from the south, saw headlights cutting through the dusk, watched as a commercial rig appeared, freightliner similar to the one he used to drive, heading north toward Tonopah and Reno, and the routes he'd hauled for 11 years. The trucker saw him standing on the shoulder, probably wondered if he needed help, if his vehicle had broken down, if he was another stranded motorist in the vast Nevada emptiness. The truck passed without stopping, taillights receding into darkness, engine noise fading to silence. And Boaz Cotterill stood alone at mile marker 92, caught between identities, between lives, between choices that all led to different versions of the same uncertain future. The desert stretched around him, patient and indifferent, waiting to see what he'd decide, waiting to swallow whatever came next. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Text from an unknown number. "Time to choose, Mr. Cotterill. 1 week. Make it count." Boaz stared at the message, then looked up at the darkening sky where stars were beginning to emerge. Same stars that had watched this highway for millennia. Same stars that would watch long after his choices and their consequences had faded into forgotten history. He thought about his daughter, about the career he'd lost, about the voice offering options that weren't really options. Thought about doing the right thing and where it had led him, about whether right choices that led to wrong outcomes were really right at all. The desert wind picked up, carrying sage and dust and the promise of another cold night. Boaz got back in the rental car, started the engine, and sat for a moment, hands on the wheel, staring at the empty highway that stretched in both directions toward futures he couldn't predict. He could drive north toward Reno, and whatever protection federal authorities might still be able to provide. He could drive south toward Las Vegas, and a different kind of disappearance. He could stay here at mile 92, waiting for the organization to make his decision for him. Or he could do something else entirely, something that hadn't been offered, something that existed outside the binary choice between cooperation and betrayal. He thought about Trooper Creed Ellison, about the federal agents who'd worked the case, about the infrastructure that had tried and failed to protect him. Thought about the sophistication of the organization that had found him despite witness protection, about the resources they could deploy, about the reality that running would never end and cooperation would never guarantee safety. The engine idled, patient as the desert, waiting for direction. And Boaz Cotterill, professional trucker who'd made correct choices that led to impossible situations, finally understood that there were no good options left, only degrees of bad. The question wasn't which choice was right anymore. The question was which choice he could live with, assuming he lived at all. He put the car in gear and pulled back onto US 95, heading north, toward Tonopah, toward Reno, toward whatever came next. The highway stretched ahead, empty and dark and infinite, and Boaz drove into it with the same instincts that had kept him alive at mile 92, not knowing if they'd serve him as well in what followed, knowing only that staying still meant surrender, and movement meant possibility. Behind him, in the darkness, another set of headlights appeared, maintaining distance, following at the same steady pace. Could be coincidence, could be another trucker on the same route, could be exactly what it appeared to be. Surveillance, monitoring, the organization tracking his movements and waiting for his decision. Boaz watched the headlights in his mirror, watched the distance hold constant, and understood with perfect clarity that this was his life now, would be his life forever, regardless of what choice he made in the week he'd been given. The headlights followed him through Tonopah, through Hawthorne, through the long, empty stretches between nowhere and nothing. And Boaz kept driving, because driving was what he did, what he'd always done, the one thing they couldn't take away even after they'd taken everything else. The highway rolled on, familiar and strange, route he'd driven 100 times, feeling for the first time like it had no destination, just continuation, just the endless unwinding of asphalt through darkness that might never end. Somewhere ahead, decisions waited. Somewhere behind, consequences followed. And Boaz Cotterell drove the space between them, suspended in motion, carrying truths that multiple organizations wanted silenced, living a life that wasn't quite his own anymore, heading toward a future that remained stubbornly unclear despite all the certainty everyone else seemed to have about what he should do, who he should be, which choices would keep him alive. The mile markers counted upward, marking distance without promising destination, and the headlights in the mirror maintained their steady following, patient as hunting animals, waiting for weakness, waiting for mistakes, waiting for the moment when Boaz's luck finally ran out and the road reached its ending. But that moment wasn't tonight, wasn't this mile, wasn't this stretch of highway. Tonight, he was still moving, still driving, still making choices 1 mile marker at a time, and that would have to be enough. The desert accepted him back without comment, wrapped him in familiar darkness and vast indifference, and US 95 stretched ahead like it always had, promising nothing, demanding everything, offering only the choice to keep driving or stop. And Boaz Cotterell, trucker without a truck, witness without security, man without identity, chose motion over stillness and rolled forward into whatever darkness held. Ames Ridgely had been hauling freight through Nevada for 8 years, and in all that time he'd learned one fundamental truth about the extraterrestrial highway. The name was a tourist gimmick, but the isolation was absolutely real. State Route 375 cut through empty country that made other desert highways look crowded, a 2-lane strip connecting nothing to nowhere, passing through Rachel, a town so small it barely qualified as a settlement. Most truckers avoided the route entirely, preferring the predictable monotony of major interstates. But Ames specialized in off-grid deliveries, supplies to mining operations, and remote facilities that paid premium rates for drivers willing to navigate questionable roads at questionable hours. This particular run started in Tonopah just after midnight in early December, temperature already dropping toward freezing, sky clear enough to see the Milky Way stretched across the darkness like spilled paint. Ames was hauling mining equipment to a private operation near Rachel, generators and pump components that some company was paying double rate to get delivered before their current equipment failed completely. The load was legitimate, paperwork clean, nothing about the job that raised red flags beyond the inconvenient timing and isolated destination. Just another night's work in a career built on accepting runs that other drivers declined. The rig was a 2017 Kenworth T680, blue cab with white trailer, reliable, if not new, maintained well enough that Ames trusted it on remote routes where breakdowns meant serious problems. He'd fueled completely in Tonopah, verified tire pressure and fluid levels, done the pre-trip inspection with the kind of attention to detail that kept trucks running when conditions went sideways. The CB radio muttered with distant traffic, sparse chatter from drivers on US 95 and I-80. But once he turned onto 375, the radio went silent. Out here, you were alone in ways that city people never experienced. Alone in ways that even other desert highways didn't quite match. The highway unwound through darkness, sage and scrub visible only as darker shapes against dark ground, mountains distant and angular against the star-bright sky. Ames kept his speed moderate, knowing that wildlife crossings and unexpected road damage were constant risks on routes this remote. His phone had lost service 20 miles back, expected and not concerning, just another aspect of running freight through country where infrastructure ended and wilderness began. The heater hummed steadily, fighting the cold that pressed against the windows, and the diesel engine's rhythm provided the kind of white noise that could either help you stay alert or lull you into dangerous inattention. Around mile marker 38, maybe 45 minutes into the run, Ames noticed the weather changing. Not gradually, like normal storm systems, but suddenly, clouds materializing from clear sky like something had switched them on. Within 10 minutes, the stars disappeared behind roiling darkness, and the first snow began falling, not the gentle flakes of normal winter weather, but dense, wind-driven precipitation that immediately reduced visibility. Ames eased off the throttle, flipped on his hazard lights, and keyed the CB mic out of habit, even though he knew no one would answer. Any commercial traffic on 375? This is a northbound rig approaching Rachel, weather deteriorating rapidly, visibility dropping to near zero. Anyone copy? Static answered him, the empty hiss of frequencies with no one listening. Ames wasn't surprised, but felt the weight of isolation settle a little heavier. Storm conditions on empty highways meant you were on your own, meant help wasn't coming if things went bad, meant every decision had to be right because there were no second chances. The snow intensified, wind gusting hard enough to rock the trailer, and Ames made the calculation every trucker dreads: push through and risk worse conditions, or stop and wait out weather that might last hours. The mining operation was expecting delivery by dawn, had emphasized that timing was critical, that their current equipment was failing, and delays would cost them significant money. But money didn't matter if you jackknifed in a ditch or lost the road in whiteout conditions. Ames decided to push forward cautiously, knowing Rachel was only another 15 miles ahead, knowing he could reassess there if conditions continued worsening. The highway became an exercise in faith, white lines barely visible through the snow, edges of the road disappearing into uniform darkness. Ames dropped his speed to 35, then 30, watching for any sign of the pavement ending or curves approaching too fast. The rig handled the conditions reasonably well, weight providing stability even as wind tried to push the trailer sideways. He'd driven through worse weather before, had made deliveries in blizzards and ice storms and conditions that shut down highways for civilian traffic. This was manageable. Barely, but manageable. Then the electrical system failed. Not gradually, not with warning indicators or preliminary flickering, just sudden complete loss of power. Headlights killed, dashboard went dark, heater stopped. Everything that depended on electricity simply ceased functioning. The engine kept running on mechanical fuel injection, but without lights, Ames was driving blind in a snowstorm at 30 miles per hour with no way to see what lay ahead. Training took over. instinct developed through years of handling emergencies. He eased off the throttle without hitting the brakes hard enough to jackknife, let the rig slow naturally, steered toward what he hoped was the shoulder, based on memory and feel. The truck rolled to a stop, engine idling, but dark, and Ames sat in sudden silence, broken only by wind howling outside and snow pounding the windshield. His first thought was alternator failure, possibly combined with battery problems, the kind of electrical cascade that shouldn't happen to properly maintained vehicles, but sometimes did anyway. He grabbed his flashlight from the door pocket, checked that it worked, then keyed the CB mic. Dead. No power to the radio meant no way to call for help, no way to contact anyone. Complete communication blackout. Ames climbed down from the cab into wind that hit like a physical force, snow already accumulating on the pavement, temperature feeling well below freezing. He made his way to the front of the truck, popped the hood, and examined the electrical system with his flashlight. What he found made no sense. The alternator belt was intact. Battery terminals showed no corrosion or looseness. All the visible components looked functional. The failure wasn't mechanical in any way he could identify. Wasn't something he could diagnose and repair roadside, even if conditions had been better. He was stuck on State Route 375 in deteriorating weather with no lights, no communication, no way to complete his delivery or call for assistance. The mining operation would eventually notice he hadn't arrived, would probably send someone to investigate, but that could be hours away. Staying with the truck was standard protocol for breakdown situations, but this truck was dark, was invisible to any other vehicles that might be traveling this road, was potentially a deadly obstacle if someone came around a curve and didn't see it until too late. Ames returned to the cab, killed the engine to conserve fuel, and assessed his options. He had emergency supplies, winter gear, food and water for several days if necessary. The cab would stay reasonably warm for a while from residual heat, and he could run the engine periodically if temperatures dropped dangerously low. But sitting and waiting felt passive, felt like surrendering control to circumstances. The other option was walking, but Rachel was still maybe 12 miles ahead based on his last-mile marker sighting, and hiking through a snowstorm in darkness was exactly the kind of decision that turned manageable situations into fatal ones. While he was weighing options, headlights appeared in his passenger mirror, approaching from behind, the first vehicle he'd seen since turning onto 375. Relief mixed with caution, because help in remote places sometimes came with complications, but any vehicle meant potential assistance, or at least communication. The headlights slowed as they approached, pulled to a stop behind his trailer, and Ames could make out the shape of a heavy-duty wrecker, the kind of tow vehicle designed for commercial trucks. A figure emerged from the wrecker and approached Ames's passenger door, knocking with gloved fist. Ames cracked the window an inch, cold air rushing in, and the man outside leaned close to be heard over the wind. "Saw you sitting dark. Having electrical problems?" The voice was male, 40s maybe, professional tone that suggested legitimate tow operator rather than opportunistic criminal. "Complete electrical failure," Ames called back. "Can't diagnose the cause, can't fix it roadside. You out of Rachel?" "Own a service operation there, or in Baskerville. If you want, I can tow you back to my shop, get you out of this weather, assess what's wrong with your electrical system. Storm's supposed to get worse before it gets better, and sitting dark on 375 in these conditions is asking for someone to rear-end you." The offer made sense, aligned with what Ames would recommend if someone else was in his situation. But something about the timing felt off, about how quickly help had appeared, about how a tow operator happened to be driving this route in deteriorating weather exactly when Ames needed assistance. Nevada highways were full of coincidences, but professional truckers learned to question coincidences that felt too convenient. "How much for the tow?" Ames asked, practical concerns overriding suspicion. Even if the timing was suspicious, he needed help, Needed to get off the highway before conditions worsened or another vehicle appeared and couldn't stop in time. 400 to my shop in Rachel, diagnostic work extra depending on what we find. Cash or card, either works, but we should move quick. Visibility's getting worse. 400 was steep, but not unreasonable for a commercial tow in remote conditions. Ames made his decision, grabbed his essential gear, and climbed down to help Baskerville position the wrecker. The tow operator worked with professional efficiency, hooking chains and engaging the lift system with the kind of smooth competence that suggested years of experience. Within 15 minutes, Ames's rig was secured, and they were heading back south toward Rachel. Snow now falling so heavily that even the wrecker's powerful headlights barely penetrated 20 feet ahead. The wrecker's cab was warm, CB radio crackling with occasional distant traffic, and Baskerville drove with the careful attention of someone who knew these roads intimately. "You were making a delivery up past Rachel?" he asked, eyes never leaving the road. "Mining operation, equipment delivery, supposed to arrive by dawn." Ames kept his answers factual but minimal, still feeling that low-grade unease about circumstances that felt orchestrated rather than accidental. "They'll understand about weather delays. Storms like this, deliveries get pushed back all the time. Main thing is you're safe, truck's safe. We'll get you sorted out." Baskerville's tone was reassuring, but something in his inflection felt rehearsed, like he was following a script designed to put clients at ease. Rachel appeared through the snow after 20 minutes, just a handful of lights marking buildings in the vast darkness. The famous Little Alla Inn glowing like a beacon for travelers and alien enthusiasts. Baskerville drove past the main strip, turned onto a side road Ames hadn't noticed on previous runs through town, pulled into a fenced compound with a large shop building and several other structures. Security lights illuminated the compound, bright enough that Ames could see this was a substantial operation, more extensive than a typical small-town tow service. "We'll park your rig in the secure lot, get you set up in the office where it's warm, then I'll start diagnostic work," Baskerville explained, maneuvering the wrecker toward a gate that opened automatically as they approached. "Probably electrical gremlins, maybe a computer module failure, something we can fix overnight if parts are available." Ames nodded, watching the gate close behind them with the kind of finality that made his unease sharpen into something more alert. The compound felt less like a repair facility and more like a secure installation. Cameras visible on every corner, heavy-duty fencing, electronic gate controls, more security than a tow operation typically warranted, more infrastructure than Rachel's tiny population would support. As Baskerville unloaded Ames's truck and guided it into position, Ames noticed other vehicles in the compound. Several work trucks with no company markings, a couple of SUVs with tinted windows, and what looked like mining equipment in various states of repair. But the configuration felt wrong, felt like the equipment was staged rather than genuinely being serviced. Ames had delivered to enough remote operations to recognize when something didn't align with stated purpose. His phone buzzed suddenly, service returning briefly, and a single text message appeared from an unknown number. "Do not accept any offers. Leave at first opportunity." The message disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared, signal dropping again, but Ames's stomach clenched with the confirmation that his instincts had been correct. This wasn't a simple breakdown and tow situation. This was something else entirely, and he was already inside the compound when he should have stayed on the highway and taken his chances with the storm. Baskerville gestured toward the office building, smile still professional, but eyes now assessing Ames with more intensity. "Come inside, get warm. We'll talk about your truck's problems." The words were innocent, but the undertone carried an edge that transformed invitation into instruction, suggestion into requirement. And Ames Ridgely, professional trucker who'd accepted a premium rate delivery to a remote mining operation, finally understood that the electrical failure hadn't been mechanical at all, that the storm and the timing and the convenient tow operator were all part of something planned, something that had him exactly where they wanted him. The office building's interior was too clean, too organized for a tow service in a town like Rachel. Ames noticed it immediately as Baskerville led him through the entrance. No grease stains, no clutter of repair manuals and parts catalogs, no coffee rings on desks or calendars with scribbled notes. Just pristine surfaces, new furniture, and that institutional smell that suggested the space had been set up recently and used minimally. A break room with a full coffee station, a conference room with whiteboards covered in diagrams Ames couldn't quite see, offices with doors closed and lights off. "Coffee's fresh," Baskerville said, gesturing toward the break room. "Help yourself while I get started on your truck. Diagnostic work usually takes an hour or two. Might have you back on the road by morning if the problem's simple." He disappeared through a door leading to the shop area before Ames could respond, leaving him alone in the too-clean office with questions multiplying faster than answers. Ames poured coffee he didn't want, just to have something to do with his hands, and moved to the window overlooking the compound. His truck sat in the secure lot under bright lights, Baskerville now working beneath the hood with tools and diagnostic equipment. Everything looked legitimate. Looked like standard repair work, but the text message kept replaying in his mind. "Do not accept any offers. Leave at first opportunity." What offers? What was he supposed to refuse? And how was he supposed to leave when his truck was disabled, when he was miles from anywhere, when storm conditions outside made walking suicidal? Ames pulled out his phone, checked for signal. Nothing. He moved around the office trying different locations, same result. Either the storm was blocking service, or something about this compound was preventing connection. Neither explanation made him feel better. The door to the shop area opened and Baskerville reappeared, expression neutral but carrying a clipboard with diagnostic printouts. "Found your problem," he said, settling into a chair across from Ames. "Computer module failure, probably from electrical surge. I can fix it, have the parts in stock actually, but here's the situation. That mining operation you were heading to? They don't exist. Address you were given, it's just empty desert. Nobody's expecting your delivery because there's no operation to deliver to." Ames felt his stomach drop. "What are you talking about? I've got legitimate paperwork, shipping manifest, contact information." "All fabricated," Baskerville interrupted, not unkindly. "Someone set up this delivery specifically to get you out here. The electrical failure wasn't mechanical, it was triggered remotely. Probably by device planted during your last maintenance stop. You've been routed to this location deliberately, Mr. Ridgely. Question is whether you're part of the operation or just an unlucky driver." The accusation should have made Ames angry, should have triggered defensive responses. Instead, he just felt tired and frightened. "I'm a trucker. I haul freight. Someone contracts a delivery, I make the delivery. That's my entire involvement." "Then you've got a problem," Baskerville said, leaning forward slightly. "Because the people who arranged this delivery, they think you're carrying something other than mining equipment. And they're willing to pay substantial money to confirm what's actually in your trailer. Now, I can fix your truck's electrical system and send you on your way. No charge, no complications. Or I can make a phone call, and some people show up who are a lot less friendly than me, who won't believe you're just an unlucky driver, who'll take your truck apart piece by piece, looking for whatever they think you're smuggling." "I'm not smuggling anything," Ames insisted, voice harder than he felt. "My load is exactly what the manifest says. Generators, pump components, standard industrial equipment." "Then you won't mind if someone verifies that?" Baskerville pulled out a phone, held it up like a threat. "One call and we open your trailer together, inventory everything, prove you're legitimate. Takes maybe an hour, you're on your way after that. Unless we find something that doesn't match the manifest." Ames thought about his trailer, about the legitimate cargo he'd loaded in Tonopah, about paperwork he'd verified personally. But he also thought about mile after mile of empty highway, about opportunities for someone to access his truck during fuel stops or rest breaks, about the possibility that his load had been compromised without his knowledge. Just like other drivers, just like operations he'd heard about through the trucker network, cargo manipulated to turn innocent haulers into unwitting smugglers. "I want to see my load," Ames said. "Right now, before any phone calls. If there's something in my trailer that shouldn't be there, I need to know." Baskerville studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough. Let's take a walk." The storm had intensified, wind driving snow horizontally across the compound, but security lights kept visibility reasonable within the fenced perimeter. Baskerville led Ames to his trailer, produced bolt cutters, and removed the seal with practiced efficiency. The doors swung open, revealing cargo exactly as Ames had loaded it. Generators strapped in place, pump components secured, inventory matching the manifest he carried. Relief flooded through him, followed immediately by confusion. "This is all legitimate equipment," Ames said. "Everything matches my paperwork. So what did whoever set this up think I was carrying?" Baskerville was examining the trailer's interior with a tactical flashlight, checking behind cargo, inspecting the walls and ceiling. Maybe they were wrong about which truck. Maybe their intelligence was bad, or maybe... He stopped, flashlight focused on a section of the trailer's front wall. "Maybe it's not about what you're carrying. It's about where you're going." He turned to face Ames directly, and the professional veneer had dropped completely. "The address you were given, it's not random empty desert. It's adjacent to a private mining operation, heavily secured, no public access. That operation has been moving equipment and personnel at unusual hours. Lots of activity that doesn't match their stated purpose. Someone thinks they're running something illegal, wants eyes on the site, and apparently decided the best approach was sending a truck right to their doorstep." "You're saying I was supposed to be reconnaissance?" Ames tried to process the implication. "Drive close enough to their operation that I'd see something, report something? Or provoke a response? You show up claiming to have a delivery, they either turn you away or let you in. Either way, someone learned something about their security procedures, their reaction protocols." Baskerville closed the trailer doors. "Problem is, the mining operation has their own ideas about uninvited visitors. They've got private security, ex-military contractors, people who don't call sheriffs when they find problems on their property." As if summoned by the conversation, headlights appeared at the compound's front gate, multiple vehicles, moving with purpose. Baskerville swore under his breath. "That's them. Must have been monitoring the highway. Saw me tow you in. Decided to preempt whatever was supposed to happen." He grabbed Ames's arm, pulled him toward a side building. "Listen carefully. Those people think you're part of an operation against them. If they take you, you disappear. No arrest, no charges, just gone. Your only chance is convincing them you're innocent, and they're not inclined to believe innocent explanations." The vehicles entered the compound, 3 SUVs with commercial mining company logos, men emerging in tactical gear despite their civilian employer. Ames counted 6 personnel, all carrying themselves like professional security, all focused on his truck with intensity that suggested this wasn't a casual inquiry. One man separated from the group, older than the others, moving with command authority. He approached Baskerville with the kind of familiarity that suggested previous dealings. "Trask Belden," the man introduced himself to Ames, not offering a handshake. "Security chief for the operation your fake delivery was targeting. Want to tell me who hired you to run reconnaissance on our facility?" "Nobody hired me for reconnaissance," Ames said, forcing his voice steady. "I'm a freight hauler. I got contracted for a delivery, loaded legitimate cargo, Headed to the specified address. That's my entire involvement." Belden studied him with eyes that had evaluated threats professionally for years. "Convenient story. Electrical failure right before you reach our perimeter. Tow truck appears immediately. You end up at a facility that just happens to service our security vehicles. None of that strikes you as coordinated?" Ames looked at Baskerville, understanding crystallizing with cold certainty. "You work for them. The tow service, this compound, all of it's part of their security operation. You weren't helping me. You were intercepting me." "Protecting our interests," Baskerville corrected. "Someone's been probing our operation for weeks, trying to get information, identify vulnerabilities. When we detected the device on your truck, when we monitored your route, we knew you were either part of it or being used as part of it. Either way, we needed to contain the situation before you reached our actual facility." Belden pulled out a tablet, showed Ames photographs of his truck from various angles, timestamps indicating surveillance over multiple days. "We've been tracking you since Tonopah, the device that failed your electrical system. We didn't plant it, we just knew it was there, waited to see what would happen when it activated. Your cargo's clean, your paperwork's legitimate, but the delivery address and timing suggest you're a pawn in someone else's operation. Question is whether you know who's playing you." Ames thought about the text message warning him not to accept offers, about the too convenient timing of his breakdown, about layers of manipulation he hadn't recognized until trapped inside them. "I don't know who set this up. I take contracts through my dispatcher, haul freight, collect payment. If someone's using me for surveillance, I'm not aware of it." "Your dispatcher?" Belden said. "Give me contact information. We're going to have a conversation with them about how contracts get arranged and who's really paying for deliveries to non-existent addresses." Ames provided the information, watched Belden make a call that lasted less than a minute, expression hardening as he listened to responses Ames couldn't hear. When the call ended, Belden's assessment of the situation was evident in his posture. "Your dispatcher claims the contract came through a broker they've used before, payment verified, nothing suspicious. But the broker's number is disconnected. Payment was cashed through a third party, whole chains designed to obscure whoever actually initiated this." "So what happens to me?" Ames asked. Exhaustion and fear combining into desperate directness. "You've determined I'm an unwitting pawn. Does that mean I'm free to go, or am I still a security risk you need to handle?" Belden exchanged a glance with Baskerville, some kind of silent communication passing between them. "You're free to go once your truck's repaired. But Mr. Ridgely understands something clearly. Our operation is legitimate, legal, and none of your concern. We employ private security because the nature of our work attracts unwanted attention from competitors and activists. You stumbling into the middle of that, even unwittingly, creates complications we'd prefer to avoid. So here's what's going to happen. Your truck gets fixed, you drive back to Tonopah, you forget this delivery ever happened. You don't file reports. Don't discuss this with other drivers. Don't try to figure out who set you up. You just move on to your next legitimate contract and stay away from State Route 375. The implicit threat was clear enough that elaboration wasn't necessary. Ames nodded acceptance, relieved to be offered exit at all, knowing that plenty of situations like this ended with drivers disappearing into desert graves. "How long to fix my truck?" 3 hours, maybe 4. Storm should clear by then, roads will be passable. Baskerville checked his watch. "Sun's coming up in 90 minutes. You'll be rolling by mid-morning, back in civilization by afternoon. Whole thing becomes a bad memory you don't share." Belden's security team conducted a thorough search of Ames's truck anyway, pulling cargo, inspecting every panel and compartment, looking for contraband or surveillance equipment or anything that might justify their suspicion. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find, and eventually replaced everything exactly as it had been loaded. professional, thorough, and deeply unsettling in its military precision. Ames spent the waiting hours in the too-clean office, drinking bad coffee, watching dawn break over the Nevada desert through windows that probably had security cameras watching him. His phone remained dead, no signal, no way to contact anyone or call for help, even if help had been an option. He thought about the text message warning, about whoever had sent it, about whether they'd achieved whatever objective this whole operation had been designed to accomplish. And he thought about how easily he'd been manipulated, routed into a situation where every choice had already been made for him. True to Baskerville's estimate, the electrical system was repaired by 9 a.m., truck functional, and showing no evidence of the remote device that had triggered the failure. Ames conducted his own pre-trip inspection, paranoid now about anything that might have been added or modified while his truck was in their control. Everything appeared normal, appeared safe, but trust was a luxury he couldn't afford anymore. "Road's clear back to Tonopah," Baskerville said, handing Ames paperwork showing a completed repair. "No charge. Consider it compensation for your inconvenience. And Mr. Ridgely? Whatever questions you have about last night, whatever curiosity you're feeling about our operation or who set you up, let it go. People who ask too many questions about things that don't concern them, they end up creating problems for themselves. You seem like a smart man. Smart men know when to forget things." Ames took the paperwork, climbed into his cab, and fired the engine. It started perfectly, all systems functioning, as if the previous night's failure had never happened. He rolled out of the compound, watching the gate close behind him with finality, turned onto the access road leading back to State Route 375, and drove away from Rachel without looking back. The storm had passed, leaving fresh snow sparkling under morning sun, the highway clear and innocent-looking in daylight. But Ames couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that cameras were still tracking his movement, that the people he'd encountered would be monitoring his compliance with their instructions. And he couldn't stop thinking about the text message, about someone who'd known enough to warn him, but not enough to prevent the situation entirely. About the mining operation and what they might be hiding that required ex-military security and aggressive responses to unintentional trespassing. About how many other drivers might have been routed into similar situations, and whether they'd all been offered the exit he'd received. Ames made it 30 miles before he noticed the tail. A dark SUV maintaining perfect distance, never closing, never dropping back, just hovering in his mirrors like a persistent shadow. He tested it by varying his speed, slowing to 50, then accelerating to 65. The SUV matched him exactly, professional surveillance that didn't bother hiding itself. The message was clear. They were watching, would continue watching, making sure he complied with the instructions to forget and stay silent. His phone gained signal around mile marker 50, immediately buzzing with accumulated messages. His dispatcher asking for delivery confirmation. A missed call from an unknown number, and another text from the same anonymous source that had warned him originally. "They're tracking you. Ditch the phone." Ames stared at the message, paranoia spiking. If they'd planted a device that failed his electrical system, what else might they have installed while his truck was in their control? He pulled into a rest area, did a thorough inspection of his cab and trailer, looking for anything that seemed new or out of place. Found nothing obvious, but the sophistication of the operation suggested surveillance devices small enough to hide anywhere. The SUV had parked at the far end of the rest area, occupant visible behind tinted windows, making no effort to conceal their presence. Ames felt trapped between certainty he was being monitored and inability to do anything about it. The drive back to Tonopah took hours that felt like days, every mile marked by the SUV's presence. Every decision weighed against the threat of what might happen if he deviated from his route or tried to contact authorities. What would he even report? That he'd been manipulated into attempting reconnaissance on a private mining operation. That he'd been intercepted, questioned, and released with warnings to stay quiet. No laws had been obviously broken. No crimes he could articulate. Just a series of events that left him feeling violated and vulnerable, but without clear recourse. Tonopah appeared like salvation, civilization and witnesses, and the relative safety of public spaces. The SUV peeled off as Ames entered town limits, disappearing down a side street, surveillance apparently concluded or handed off to someone else. Ames drove straight to his company's yard, backed the trailer into its designated spot, and sat in his cab for long minutes, just processing the fact that he'd made it back, that the situation hadn't escalated into violence, that he was still alive and free. His dispatcher met him at the yard office, expression confused and irritated. "What happened? Mining operation says you never arrived, wants to know if we're holding their equipment hostage. I've got a client threatening to sue, and you've been unreachable for 12 hours. Where the hell were you?" Ames thought about Baskerville's warning, about Belden's implicit threats, about the SUV that had followed him for 30 miles. Thought about his career, his livelihood, the reality that drivers who caused problems for powerful interests found themselves unemployable. "Electrical failure in the storm," he said, keeping his voice neutral. "Got towed to a shop in Rachel. Took hours to diagnose and repair. By the time I was rolling again, delivery window had passed. Client gave me a fake address anyway, probably some kind of scam." The dispatcher's suspicion was evident, but he didn't push. "Client already pulled the contract, demanded refund of the deposit. They're claiming you were hired to spy on their operation, that the delivery was never legitimate. Legal's looking into it, but honestly, the whole thing smells wrong. I'm pulling you from remote routes until this gets sorted out." "Fine by me," Ames said, meaning it. "I'm done with 375, done with deliveries to nowhere, done with premium rates that come with complications. Give me standard routes, major highways, destinations with actual addresses." He went home to his apartment, showered away the grime and fear, and tried to sleep. But every noise in the building made him alert. Every car in the parking lot became potential surveillance. Every shadow carried threat. The text message had warned him they were tracking, and he believed it, felt the weight of observation like physical pressure. His phone sat on the nightstand, dark and silent, possibly compromised, but the only communication device he owned. Days passed. Ames ran local deliveries, short hauls that kept him close to populated areas, nothing that required venturing onto remote highways. The company's investigation concluded that the delivery contract had been fraudulent, brokered through channels designed to obscure the actual client's identity. No one filed charges, no one pursued the matter legally. The whole incident just faded into administrative paperwork and closed case files. But Ames couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Not constantly, not obsessively, just periodically. A familiar SUV in a parking lot, a face that appeared in his mirrors too often to be coincidence. Small signs that someone was keeping tabs. Making sure he remembered the warnings. Making sure he understood the consequences of talking. 3 weeks after Rachel, a package arrived at his apartment. No return address. Postmarked from Las Vegas. Inside was a burner phone and a brief note. "If you want answers about who set you up and why, power this on at midnight tonight. If you want to forget and live normally, throw it away." No signature, no identifier, just the same anonymous source that had warned him before. Ames stared at the phone for hours, weighing curiosity against self-preservation. Answers meant understanding, meant maybe finding leverage or protection. But answers also meant deeper involvement, meant confirming that he wasn't willing to stay silent, meant violating the instructions that had kept him alive so far. The smart choice was obvious. Throw away the phone, forget the questions, accept that some things weren't meant to be understood. At 11:55 p.m., he powered on the burner phone. At midnight exactly, it rang. He answered without speaking, waiting for whoever had orchestrated this to make the first move. "Mr. Ridgely." The voice was filtered, electronically distorted, gender indeterminate. "You've been patient, stayed quiet, followed instructions. That shows intelligence. But you deserve to know what you were caught in the middle of. The mining operation that intercepted you, they're not mining anything legitimate. They're processing and moving materials that multiple federal agencies would very much like to know about. Someone hired you as a probe, testing their security response, gathering data on their procedures. That someone thought you were expendable, thought if you disappeared no one would look hard enough to find you." "Who hired me?" Ames asked, voice rough. "Who set up the fake delivery?" "People who profit from information about illegal operations. People who sell intelligence to whoever pays best, whether that's law enforcement or competitors or foreign interests. You were a disposable asset in a game you never knew existed." The distorted voice paused. "The text warnings you received. That was me trying to give you a chance. I don't like operations that treat drivers as expendable pawns. What do you want from me?" Ames felt exhaustion settling deeper. "Why tell me this now?" "Because you have a choice. You can stay quiet, live with surveillance, hope they eventually decide you're not a threat. Or you can provide testimony to federal agents building a case against that mining operation. Your description of their security response, their facilities, their personnel, it's evidence they can use. But testifying means putting yourself in their crosshairs permanently. Means accepting protection that might not protect you, trusting authorities who might not prioritize your safety over their case. The same impossible choice from different angles. Stay silent and live under shadow surveillance, or speak up and become a target for people with resources and motivation to silence threats. Ames thought about the life he'd built as a trucker, about independence and mobility and the freedom of making his own choices. All of it compromised now, all of it contingent on other people's decisions about whether he was a problem or a resource. "I'm not testifying," Ames said finally. "I'm not involving federal agents, not becoming a witness, not painting a bigger target on myself. I just want to drive trucks, make deliveries, live my life without these complications." "That's understandable. But Mr. Ridgely, understand something. Those people at the mining operation, they're not going to forget about you just because you stay quiet. You're a witness to their security procedures, their personnel, their location. Even if you never talk, you're a potential problem. They'll keep watching you, keep evaluating whether you're a risk, and someday they might decide proactive elimination is safer than continued surveillance." The filtered voice continued before Ames could respond. "The burner phone has one contact programmed. Federal agent who specializes in operations like the one you encountered. If you ever decide testimony is preferable to living under permanent threat, call that number. Otherwise, good luck, Mr. Ridgely. You're going to need it." The call disconnected. Ames stared at the phone, at the single contact labeled simply protection, at the choice that wasn't really a choice at all. He thought about Belden's security team, about Baskerville's warnings, about the SUV that had followed him for 30 miles. Thought about a future where every delivery carried the shadow of surveillance, where every remote route raised questions about whether he'd make it back. He should destroy the burner phone, should eliminate the temptation to call federal agents, should commit fully to silence and hope it bought him safety. Instead, he hid the phone in his apartment, tucked away where he could find it if circumstances changed, if the surveillance intensified, if staying quiet stopped feeling like protection and started feeling like waiting for inevitable violence. Weeks became months. Ames kept running local deliveries, kept his head down, kept his truck maintained and his routes predictable. The surveillance faded to background noise, occasional enough that he could almost pretend it wasn't happening, infrequent enough that paranoia started to feel like overreaction. Life developed a new normal, restricted and cautious but stable enough to be sustainable. Then his dispatcher called with a problem. Got an urgent delivery, premium rate, needs to reach a facility outside Rachel by tomorrow morning. I know you're off remote routes, but everyone else is booked, and this client's threatening to take their business elsewhere if we can't fulfill. It's legitimate, established mining company, nothing shady about it. Can you make the run? Ames felt his stomach clench at the mention of Rachel, at the coincidence that felt too precise to be accidental. What's the client's name? What facility? The dispatcher read off details that meant nothing to Ames. Company name he'd never heard, address that could be verified through public records. But the location was close enough to the facility he'd encountered before that overlap seemed inevitable, and the timing suggested someone was testing whether he'd refuse, whether his caution would reveal continued concern about that night's events. I'll take it, Ames heard himself say, because refusing felt like admission, like confirming he had reasons to avoid the area. Load it up, I'll roll tonight. He drove toward Rachel in darkness, watching his mirrors constantly, checking his phone for anonymous warnings that never came. The highway felt different now, familiar but threatening, every mile marker a reminder of the night everything had changed. His trailer carried legitimate cargo, his paperwork was clean, but none of that mattered if someone decided he was a problem worth resolving. The delivery address turned out to be real, an actual mining facility with legitimate operations and normal security procedures. Ames made the delivery without incident, collected signatures, and headed back toward Tonopah as dawn broke over the desert. No surveillance, no confrontations, no complications. Just a standard delivery that happened to be near the facility that had changed his life. But as he passed the access road leading to Baskerville's compound, Ames noticed fresh activity. Multiple vehicles, law enforcement markings, federal agents conducting some kind of operation. He slowed without stopping, caught glimpses of people in tactical gear, evidence being loaded into trucks, the organized chaos of a raid in progress. His phone buzzed. Text from the burner phone's single contact. Investigation concluded successfully. Your surveillance will cease. Thank you for your patience. Ames stared at the message, at the implication that someone had been protecting him, using him as bait, keeping him under watch while building a case against the operation he'd stumbled into. He should have felt relief. Instead, he just felt used, manipulated again by different people with different agendas, but the same disregard for his autonomy. The surveillance might cease, but the knowledge wouldn't fade. The understanding that powerful interests had turned him into a pawn, twice, and might do so again whenever circumstances aligned. Ames drove back to Tonopah, back to his normal life, carrying truths he couldn't share and questions he couldn't answer. State Route 375 disappeared behind him, the extraterrestrial highway living up to its reputation for isolation and strangeness, though the threats he'd encountered had been thoroughly human. And as mile markers counted down toward civilization, Ames wondered how many other truckers ran routes without knowing they were pieces in someone else's operation, delivering loads that weren't what they seemed, carrying secrets they'd never been told about. The desert kept its mysteries, and Ames Ridgely kept driving.